Chapter 358. Shortly after Weber left, the door of the study opened again. Colin looked up and saw Vera, who was wearing a beige dress, walking into the study quietly. "Colin, are you busy?" "No, what's the matter?" Colin put down his quill and got up to walk around the desk. He then hugged his wife's waist and kissed her gently on her red lips. Vera hugged her husband's arm and her delicate nose twitched a few times before she asked in confusion, "Why is there a smell of blood in the room?" "I just taught a guy a lesson and forgot to ask the maid to clean him up." "Oh." Vera nodded and did not mind. She then asked softly, "Is Prince Harrison and Princess Judy doing well in the agate manor?" "They are doing very well. The scenery there is beautiful and you can even ride a horse. The two little guys are not willing to come to Winter City." "That's good." Colin saw that Vera was hesitant to speak, so he asked with a smile, "Have you heard anything?" Vera nodded and said, "I have heard some rumors and Joyce came to me crying just now." Colin chuckled and tightened his arms around Vera's waist before he asked, "Do you think that Joyce is plotting something against Princess Judy?" Vera bit her pink lips and hesitated for a moment before she shook her head and said, "I was not there, so I can't make a judgment." But what?" Vera raised her head and looked at her husband seriously before she said, "But after all, he is my younger brother. I still hope that he can live a peaceful life." Colin blinked and smiled. "Of course, I also hope that he can live a peaceful life like any other ordinary aristocrat." Colin could understand Vera's concerns. After all, Joyce was her younger brother. Even if he had competed with her for the position of the Dukes of the North and was now plotting something against her in private, he knew that Vera would not be willing to do anything. Therefore, Colin gave his promise that he would not harm Joyce's life. Of course, he would not be able to count on any power in this life. Vera understood the meaning of Colin's words and she smiled before she kissed him again. Knock, knock, knock. Just as Colin was enjoying Vera's tenderness, there was a sudden knock on the door. Colin asked impatiently, "What is it?" The butler's voice sounded outside the door, "Master, Madam, the Earl of Avon from the East and his fiancée, Miss Shelia, is here to see you." Colin sighed and could only reply, "Please ask them to wait in the living room." "Yes." Vera broke free from Colin's arms and her face was still red. She helped Colin to tidy up his collar and asked, "Why are the two of them in Winter City?" "Shelia is here to see her father, Prince Lacy. As for the Earl of Avon, he." Before Vera could ask Colin why he sneered just now, she heard him say, "Let's go. Let's go entertain these two distinguished guests. Earl of Avon, Miss Shelia, welcome to the Lion's Roar Castle. Honorable Duke of St. Hilda, Earl Angeli, thank you for your warm hospitality. I hope that our presumptuous visit did not cause you too much trouble." "Of course not. The Lion's Roar Castle is always open to friendly friends." After some small talk, the four of them sat down and the maid quickly served coffee and desserts. Colin looked back and forth between the Earl of Avon and Shelia. He then asked with a smile, "The two of you came to the northern frontier this time because of Prince Lacy, right?" Vera looked at her husband and was surprised that he was so direct. Shelia did not seem to care about Colin's slightly rude question. She nodded honestly and said, "Yes, Earl. I did follow my father's footsteps to the northern frontier. At that time, there were still many doubts about Consul Leadham's death. I know it's hard to convince you that my father is innocent based on his one-sided story, but he did come to the northern region because he found some clues. So, if the House of St. Hilda can help me to determine my father's whereabouts, let me get in touch with him, and even help to clear my father's name, then I will be grateful for your kindness for the rest of my life." Vera frowned slightly and said hesitantly, "Miss Shelia, I am also very sorry about what happened to your father. However, before there is conclusive evidence, I cannot use the power of the House of St. Hilda to help you or your father. After all, I cannot let my family's reputation be tarnished. I hope you can understand this." Shelia's eyes dimmed. Although she had already guessed the result, she could not help but feel disappointed. However, she did not hold a grudge against Vera. After all, Prince Lacy was now carrying the crime of killing a governor. No family would be willing to help him publicly. The Earl of Avon gently patted the back of his fiancée's hand under the table to comfort her. Just as he was about to speak, Colin suddenly said, "Miss Shelia, I just met Prince Lacy half a month ago." "Really? Where is it?" Shelia looked up in surprise and asked anxiously. "In Swan City." Swan City? The Earl of Avon's heart skipped a beat. He immediately thought of the recent upheaval in Swan City. "Is my father still in Swan City?" Shelia asked hurriedly. Judging from her impatient look, she would probably rush to Swan City as soon as she got a positive answer from Colin. However, under Shelia's disappointed gaze, Colin slowly shook his head and said, "I don't think so. He shouldn't be here." "Then do you know where my father might have gone?" Shelia asked tentatively. She did not have much hope in the first place. Based on her understanding of her father, it was impossible for him to reveal his whereabouts to someone he did not know well. However, to her surprise, Colin nodded and said, "Prince Lacy should have gone to Floral City." Shelia's face lit up and she hurriedly asked, "Really?" "It's not that I don't believe you, Earl Angeli, but why would my father go to Floral City?" Colin said half-truthfully, "You should have heard about what happened in Swan City, right?" "That's right. Prince Lacy actually appeared in Swan City to investigate the death of Bishop John." Hearing this, the Earl of Avon asked doubtfully, "Isn't Bishop John's death because of Lucien? Why would His Highness go to Floral City?" "Lucien is indeed one of the accomplices, but the real mastermind is someone else." "Who is it?" Colin took a sip of his coffee, seemingly hesitant about this question. After hesitating for a moment, he said slowly, "I'm sorry, even I can't confirm the identity of the mastermind, so I can't tell you now." The Earl of Avon rolled his eyes and said, "Could this have something to do with the Morrison family?" "Prince Lacy did have such a guess," Colin said decisively. The Earl of Avon stared at Colin for a while, but he could not find any clues, so he asked tentatively, "Earl Angeli, why is His Highness so interested in the death of Bishop John?" Colin shrugged and said, "I'm not sure about this. Maybe he thinks it has something to do with the death of Consul Leadham." The Earl of Avon fell into deep thought. He did not fully believe Colin's words, but he could not figure out the other party's intentions. Shelia, who was at the side, could not hold back and quickly thanked him, "Earl Angeli, thank you for the information you provided. If you need any help in the future, please don't hesitate to ask." After saying this, Miss Shelia, who was quite energetic, immediately got up and said goodbye to Vera and Colin. Vera tried to persuade her to stay, but how could Shelia, who was worried about her father, stay for long? She immediately said goodbye and left the Lion's Roar castle. Colin watched the two leave until they disappeared into the distance. Only then did he arrange for two blood slaves to secretly follow them. In fact, the reason he encouraged Shelia to go to Floral City was to confirm Prince Lacy's whereabouts through them. That prince should have arrived in Floral City a long time ago, but Colin's spies there didn't find any movement. He didn't know if Prince Lacy hadn't found the mysterious basement, or if the Morrison family had moved the blood pool in advance. In short, Colin did not know what the prince was doing or where he was. This made him feel somewhat uneasy. But he could not send a blood slave to follow a paladin, so he could only try to find out Prince Lacy's whereabouts by following Shelia. Moreover, he deliberately mentioned the death of Bishop John because he wanted the Earl of Avon to take Shelia to investigate this matter. It would be best if he could catch Mr. Lacy's tail. If he could make Prince Lacy and Mr. Lacy fight again, then Colin could not be happier. These two people were invisible bombs to the northern frontier. Colin could not wait for them to fight and die together. Chapter 359. After leaving the Lion's Roar fort and returning to his residence, the Earl of Avon immediately packed his things and prepared to head to Floral Whisper City. Now that he thought about it, he felt that Colin had deliberately chased him away from chilly winter castle. The Earl of Avon wasn't too surprised. Previously, when Joyce followed Night Webb to visit Colin, he realized that he would definitely be feared by Colin. Of course, he couldn't do anything about it. Shelia wanted to find Prince Rhy, and even though the Earl of Avon was her fiancé, he couldn't stop her. Moreover, this was something that the Earl of Avon had to do. Prince Rhy had given him a choice after the incident at Imperial Dragon City. Since he had chosen to believe that Prince Rhy was innocent, the Earl of Avon could only follow this path. Only by finding Prince Rhy and clearing his name could the Earl of Avon obtain the support and status that he wanted. To the Earl of Avon, this was his top priority. As for creating chaos at the northern frontier and planting a few spies, that was something that he could do along the way. After packing his luggage as quickly as possible, the Earl of Avon found Shelia, who was still packing, and said, "Continue packing. I'm going out for a while. I'll be back soon." Okay. After bidding farewell to Shelia, the Earl of Avon changed into a low-profile outfit and walked out of his residence. After wandering aimlessly on the streets of chilly winter castle, he casually walked into a tavern. In the tavern, the Earl of Avon went to the second floor and sat in a lavishly decorated private room. He drank the wine that was served by the waiter alone. The strange thing was that although the Earl of Avon was alone, there were 2 wine glasses on the table. Before long, the chairman of the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce, Arnold, walked into the room quietly and bowed to the Earl of Avon. "Please take a seat." The Earl of Avon poured a glass of wine for Arnold. Arnold sat down and thanked him. He drank the wine in the glass in one gulp and asked, "Earl of Avon, do you have any orders for me?" The Earl of Avon sipped the wine in his hand and said calmly, "I'm leaving chilly winter castle." Arnold's eyes flashed, and he hurriedly asked, "So soon? Are you going back to the eastern region?" "No. I'm going to Floral Whisper City. If you need anything, you can find me there." "Of course." Arnold nodded. The Earl of Avon glanced at the merchant in front of him and asked, "I asked you to contact the merchants of the northern frontier. How's it going?" Arnold frowned and said with some difficulty, "Earl of Avon, you know the current situation of the northern frontier. Although I've tried my best to rope them in, that Oliver has the support of Earl Angeli and used the position of the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company as bait to rope in a large number of powerful merchants of the northern frontier." So, seeing that the Earl of Avon was not worried, Arnold hurriedly said, "Earl of Avon, in fact, I think it's too difficult to compete with the House of St. Hilda for the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company. Also, the goal is too obvious. It's too easy to expose ourselves. I'm sure you know that Earl Angeli is not a soft-hearted person. Especially now that young Master Joyce's situation is not good, I'm worried that if we anger him." The Earl of Avon lightly tapped the wine glass and fell into deep thought. He knew that the recent events had made this merchant shrink back. But at the moment, the Earl of Avon could not find a good reason to let Arnold continue working for him. Arnold saw that the Earl of Avon did not speak, so he suggested again, "Earl of Avon, I think we can find another way. We can use a more subtle but fatal strategy to cut off the House of St. Hilda's hand in controlling the business of the northern frontier." The Earl of Avon's expression changed and immediately said, "Tell me about it." "My lord, the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company is too big of a target, and Earl Angeli values it too much. It's not wise for us to go head-to-head with them. I've thought about it for a long time, and I think it's better to start with bonds. It might be more appropriate." "Bonds?" "Yes, this is also a policy that Earl Angeli is preparing to implement in the northern frontier. Haven't you heard about it?" "I know what bonds are about. Just tell me your idea." "Yes." Arnold cleared his throat and explained with a little excitement, "My lord, did you notice that the bonds that Earl Angeli is going to issue are not limited to the qualifications of the purchasers? That is to say, even the merchants in the eastern region can use food to exchange for bonds with the House of St. Hilda. If you are careful, you don't even need to alert the House of St. Hilda. You can use a trustworthy middleman to exchange food for bonds. The Earl of Avon's eyes lit up. It was obvious that he realized something. Arnold saw this and seemed to be encouraged. He immediately said with more enthusiasm, "In this way, you can use the funds of the eastern region to intervene in the business of the northern frontier. Once we have a large amount of bonds in our hands, we will have an important handle on the House of St. Hilda. When the bond matures, you can buy a large amount of food and push up the price of food. At that time, these bonds will become a huge crisis for the House of St. Hilda. If they are willing to pay the bonds, they will have to buy food at a high price. In this way, you can make a lot of money anyway. But if they go back on their word, or if they are unable to buy enough food to pay the bonds in your hands, it will seriously damage the reputation of the House of St. Hilda. It may even lead to a new round of turmoil in the northern frontier. Of course, the eastern region will also lose some money. After all, the bonds you have hoarded will become waste paper. But the eastern region is rich. My lord, if you can spend a sum of money to mess up the northern frontier, is it worth it? Of course it is worth it. The Earl of Avon immediately answered. He then raised his glass and clinked it with Arnold. His face was full of praise. In the eyes of the Earl of Avon, this plan was indeed very good. It was hidden enough, but it was also very insidious. Whether or not the House of St. Hilda was willing to pay the bonds in the future, the eastern region would make a profit. To be honest, in terms of military strength, the eastern region was indeed very close to the northern frontier. The years of stability without the threat of foreign enemies had eroded the will of the eastern region knights. Unless it was absolutely necessary, the Earl of Avon did not want to fight to the death with the people of the northern frontier on the battlefield. But in terms of economic strength, the wealth of the eastern region was far beyond the reach of the northern frontier. Therefore, even if the northern frontier chose to renege on the bonds because of the high price of food, the Earl of Avon would not feel distressed. Spending a little money to destroy the reputation of a paladin family that had been accumulated for thousands of years was really worth it. The more the Earl of Avon thought about it, the more excited he became. He exchanged glasses with Arnold and soon finished a bottle of red wine. Arnold was about to ask the waiter to send some good wine, but fortunately, the Earl of Avon remembered that his fiancée was still waiting for him, so he quickly stopped him. "No, I can't drink any more today. I have to go to Floral City later." Arnold looked regretful, but he did not try to persuade him. The Earl of Avon kindly patted Arnold's shoulder and asked him to come to Floral City to find him at any time. When the time came, he would drink with him to his heart's content. Arnold was naturally flattered. He nodded repeatedly and sent the Earl of Avon out. When he returned to the room, Arnold found that there was another person sitting in the Earl of Avon's seat. However, he was not surprised at all. He stepped forward and bowed to Angeli. "Count Angeli, I did what you asked me to do." Colin played with the wine glass that the Earl of Avon just drank from and said with a smile, "Mr. Arnold, you made the right choice." "Mr. Arnold, you've made the right choice. I'm very pleased." Chapter 360. In the tavern's private room. Arnold, who had just been discussing with the Earl of Avon how to dig a hole for the House of St. Hilda, was now respectfully pouring wine for Colin and smiling flatteringly. "My lord, I'm a citizen of the northern frontier after all. Of course, I'm loyal to the northern frontier. That Saint Prospero Evan actually overestimated himself and tried to encourage me to betray the northern frontier. What a joke." Colin looked at the righteous northern frontier merchant in front of him with a faint smile, as if he had forgotten that Arnold had secretly contacted the Earl of Avon in the Butter Tavern. Obviously, if Colin did not have something on him, how could Arnold suddenly become a loyal and unyielding citizen of the northern frontier? Colin would never forget that these merchants were willing to sell anything for the sake of profit. But fortunately, he could give them greater benefits as long as they were obedient. Similarly, if they were not obedient, he could take everything away from them. "Mr. Arnold, you're really a model for the merchants of the northern frontier." My lord, you flatter me. In my heart, you're the model for the knights of the northern frontier, the best among the nobles. The two of them flattered each other sincerely for a while, then raised their wine glasses and toasted their friendship. After downing the wine in his cup, Arnold put down the cup and quietly sized up Colin's expression. He then probed, "Sir, I'm not sure if you'll be able to do anything." He then asked tentatively, "My lord, there's something I don't know if I should ask." Colin casually glanced at him and said indifferently, "Don't worry, I won't go back on my word." "Don't you believe in my credibility?" "No, no, no." Arnold waved his hand and said, "My lord, you misunderstood. Of course, I believe that you won't mistreat your loyal subordinates. I just don't understand why you would give the eastern frontier such an opportunity to make a fortune." "Get rich?" Colin sneered. "You also think that it's a good opportunity to get rich?" Arnold was worried, but he still mustered up his courage and said, "Sir, are you really going to renege on those bonds? With all due respect, I'm afraid this will severely damage the reputation of the House of St. Hilda." Colin laughed and teased, "You're not bad. You're starting to think for the House of St. Hilda." Of course, the great House of St. Hilda holds a high place in the hearts of every citizen of the northern frontier. Arnold said with a pious expression, as if he was worshipping his own religion. Colin ignored Arnold's display of loyalty and lightly said, "Don't worry, the House of St. Hilda will not destroy its own reputation. No matter who comes to the Lion's Roar fort with matured bonds, we will honor them, even if they are from the Eastern Territory. However, if you say that the Eastern frontier can make a fortune by hoarding bonds and manipulating food prices, then you're taking it for granted." Arnold looked puzzled and asked, "Sir Count, please forgive my stupidity, but I don't quite understand what you mean." In fact, the trap that Colin dug for the Earl of Avon was, to put it bluntly, a simple operation similar to futures. At this time, the Earl of Avon was buying food at a low price in the eastern frontier and bringing it to the northern frontier to exchange for bonds. These bonds could be regarded as futures contracts. On the day of the future delivery, when the bonds matured, as long as the price of food in the northern frontier was higher than the current price in the eastern frontier, the Earl of Avon could rely on this difference to make a fortune. He could even make the House of St. Hilda unable to come up with enough money to buy the corresponding food, thus resulting in a credit default. But there was a key problem here: the price of food at the time of delivery must be higher than the current price. Otherwise, the eastern frontier would suffer a loss. The reason why Arnold and the Earl of Avon were fooled was because their thinking was limited by this era. In this era of insufficient productivity, food had always been in a state of insufficient food. Therefore, it was very easy to raise the price of food. If there was a war, or even if several large chambers of commerce joined forces to hoard food, the price of food would soar to the sky. This was also the source of the Earl of Avon's confidence. In his view, it would not be difficult to manipulate the price of food all the way up in the future, and he would certainly be able to make the House of St. Hilda swallow the bitter fruit. But he did not know that Colin was determined to let Scholar Sonny implement the new farming and animal husbandry system in the northern frontier. Moreover, Colin was also confident that with the popularization of this new farming and animal husbandry system, the northern frontier would become more and more abundant in the future, and the price of food would certainly fall all the way. This was the general trend determined by the relationship between supply and demand. If the eastern frontier wanted to reverse this trend, they would have to be prepared to be crushed and swept away by this flood. Of course, Colin didn't intend to explain this to Arnold. After all, he still couldn't completely trust this merchant. Thus, he only said indifferently, he just said lightly, "Then you should pay attention to the future trend of food prices and see if the eastern frontier can really make a fortune, or even use this to threaten the House of St. Hilda." Arnold nodded his head in confusion, but he did not dare to ask more. Colin gave Arnold a few more words to let him feel at ease in this promising undercover job, and then he left. 3 days later, the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company, which Colin had high hopes for, was finally officially established. More than 500 large and small northern frontier merchants gathered in the banquet hall of the Lion's Roar Castle to witness this historic moment. Since the Earl of Avon's attention was diverted by Colin to the bonds, without the eastern frontier secretly intervening, it did not take much effort for Colin to successfully occupy nearly 60% of the shares of the new company. Of course, such a large sum of money was certainly not enough for the shallow Angeli family. Even if they invested all the war reparations of the Great Demon Empire, it would still not be enough. Fortunately, with the help of the House of St. Hilda, the Oman family, the Schultz family, and the Half-Elf Kingdom's Miller family, Colin was able to successfully control the board of directors and become the first chairman of the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company. Oliver was also appointed as the company's first general manager by Vera as he wished. Moreover, the management team of the company, especially the two most important departments, were the backbone of the original Tulip Chamber of Commerce. At this point, a Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company under Colin's complete control was finally established. In Colin's vision, it would become a weapon for him to integrate and control the Northern Frontier's business community, as well as to carry out economic invasion. At the same time, the Northern Frontier Charity Foundation was also announced. Compared to the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company, the foundation's establishment was very low-key. Moreover, besides Colin, no one else was aware of its huge potential and real role. After dealing with the business community's problems, Colin began to prepare for his trip to the Half-Elf Kingdom. In fact, the current hidden dangers in the Northern Frontier had not been completely eliminated, such as Mr. Kong, Prince Rhy, and the Morrison family. However, Colin felt that these problems were quite troublesome and could not be dealt with for the time being. Fortunately, he had already reached an agreement with Mr. Kong. Although Colin had doubts about the reliability of this agreement, he believed that Mr. Kong would not cause too much trouble in the Northern Frontier in the short term. After all, he and Colin did have a basis for cooperation in some aspects. What's more, Prince Rhy was watching this terrible mage. Colin could only temporarily put these hidden dangers aside to deal with a more important and urgent problem, food. Queen Aisha had sent a letter. Compared to the last time when they were unprepared, this time the half-elf grain merchants had united. They did not want to be forced by Colin to buy a large amount of food at a low price like last year. Moreover, behind them, there seemed to be the support of the eastern region. Therefore, Colin was ready to take the Blood Cavalry to Silvermoon City this time to teach the half-elf merchants a lesson. After half a year of development, the Blood Cavalry had now expanded to a scale of nearly 20,000 people. Although there was still a big gap between them and the Black Cavalry at its peak, it could already be considered a terrifying military force. At least in the Half-Elf Kingdom, there was no force that could threaten it. Unless the eastern region sent a large number of troops to the Half-Elf Kingdom. In that case, it might be a good thing for Colin. Because this meant that the eastern region gave up their biggest geographical advantage, the New Shui River. Colin was very willing to form the Northern Frontier Coalition Army and compete with the Eastern Region Army in the Half-Elf Kingdom. However, this was just Colin's own thought. As long as the Duke of St. Prospero was not stupid, he would not do this. In late September, after bidding farewell to Vera, Colin personally led the Blood Cavalry to leave Winter City and set off for Silvermoon City. Chapter 361. Half-Elf Kingdom, Shadow Canyon. This canyon was a shame that could never be washed away for the Black Cavalry. The ambush a year ago had caused most of the essence of the Black Cavalry to be buried here forever. Today, as the successor of the Black Cavalry, the Blood Cavalry passed by this place again. This time, even without Colin's special instructions, Knight Roger personally led the vanguard and prepared to check every nook and cranny of the canyon to ensure that the tragedy from the last time would not happen again. The towering cliffs blocked the sunlight and shrouded the whole canyon in darkness. Unknown weeds and fungi still thrived in such an environment. Perhaps this was thanks to the tragic battle last year. Countless corpses and large amounts of blood became the best nourishment for these wild plants. In a sense, life was indeed a kind of reincarnation. The human graveyard was a paradise for plants. Walking in the canyon, Knight Roger's heart was heavy. The air was still filled with the smell of blood, and his ears seemed to recall the tragic battle that day. Although Colin had led them to annihilate the Sky Horse Legion in Silvermoon City, which could be regarded as revenge for the dead soldiers of the Black Cavalry, the shame of the Shadow Canyon still lingered in the hearts of every Blood Cavalry soldier. Knight Roger thought that perhaps one day, the Blood Cavalry would be able to break into the White Dew City and hang the corpse of the Duke of St. Prospero on the city wall. Only then would the hatred and shame of the past be completely washed away. Knight Roger was very confident about the arrival of this day. As Colin's confidant and the commander of the Blood Cavalry, Knight Roger certainly knew some of Colin's plans and ambitions. He also knew about the conflicts between the northern frontier and the eastern region. In Knight Roger's view, Colin would sooner or later march into the eastern region. Everything he was doing now was to prepare for this. Who is it? Just when Knight Roger was looking forward to the future, the sound of the Sentinel Cavalry suddenly came from the front. Knight Roger's heart tightened. He quickly urged his warhorse to go in the direction of the sound. Don't be impulsive. Sirs, I have no ill intentions. I'm the son of Knight Ron, the mayor of Alfalfa City. My name is Jason Lute, and I'm waiting for Count Angeli. In the face of the ferocious bloody cavalry, Jason was so scared that he could not speak fluently. However, even after he announced his identity, the spear tip that was flickering with cold light still did not retract. Just as Jason was about to speak, he saw a knight in bright armor, who was obviously a high-ranking officer, come over. How did you know that the bloody cavalry would pass by here at this time? Knight Roger asked coldly. Due to the recent experience, Knight Roger was now very sensitive to any accidents. Hearing this, Jason immediately understood the other party's concerns, and quickly explained with a bitter face, Sir Knight, how can I know the exact whereabouts of the bloody cavalry? My father, Knight Ron, told me that Count Angeli would come to Silvermoon City soon, so he asked me to wait here. To tell you the truth, I've been waiting here for more than a month, and now you've finally arrived. Only then did Knight Roger feel relieved. You come with me. Knight Roger waved to Jason, and then ordered his subordinates, you guys continue to search the canyon, don't miss any suspicious places. Yes. Jason took a deep breath, quickly jumped on his horse, and followed Knight Roger to the other side of the canyon. The two passed through the canyon, walked for about 10 miles, and arrived at the camp of the Bloody Cavalry. Due to Knight Roger's personal guidance, Jason quickly arrived at the main camp and met Count Angeli, whom he had met once before. Count Angeli, I'm sorry. I'm Jason, the son of Knight Ron Lute, the mayor of Alfalfa City. On behalf of my father, I would like to express the most sincere welcome to you. Lute? Colin repeated this family name, and finally remembered that it was a prominent family in the Half-Elf Kingdom. He also remembered that when Alfalfa City was exchanging prisoners with the Eastern region, he had asked Queen Aisha to appoint a mayor of Alfalfa City to resist the Eastern region's infiltration of Alfalfa City. At that time, the mayor chosen by Queen Aisha was the nephew of the former commander of the Silvermoon Guard, the Duke of Lute, Knight Ron. You've been waiting for me here, what's the matter? Jason smiled flatteringly and invited, Lord Count, my father knows that you're about to pass by Alfalfa City, so he specially sent me to welcome you. He's waiting for your arrival in Alfalfa City. Colin rolled his eyes, speechless at the shamelessness of the mayor of Alfalfa City. Shadow Canyon was more than 100 kilometers away from Alfalfa City, and from here to Silvermoon City, it was obviously to the south, and it wasn't the same road. How could this be called passing by? It seems that your Lute family isn't doing well in Alfalfa City. Colin mercilessly exposed Jason. Jason smiled awkwardly. He also knew that his father's purpose was easy to guess, but at this time, the Lute family really needed foreign aid. The situation in Alfalfa City was very bad, so he could only smile and say, Lord Count, you can rest assured that as long as you lead the Blood Cavalry to Alfalfa City, those rats who only dare to hide in the sewers will definitely run away. Colin chuckled. Of course, he wouldn't have any doubts about this. The so-called Alfalfa Brotherhood supported by the Eastern region was nothing more than an organization composed of bandits and criminals. Let alone the Blood Cavalry, in front of any regular army, they would flee at the sight of the wind. But what was the use of that? Alfalfa City's geographical location was too special. It happened to be at the junction of the Crystal River and the New Shui River. Even if the Blood Cavalry could easily occupy the northwest city, without the support of the navy, they wouldn't dare to rashly cross the river and occupy the other two cities. Unless the northern frontier could control the New Shui River and the Crystal River, otherwise, it would be meaningless to march into Alfalfa City. Moreover, in Colin's view, Alfalfa City was a poisonous fruit thrown out by the eastern region. They wanted to tempt the northern frontier to swallow it. But how could Colin be fooled? Before he formed a strong navy, Colin would never choose Alfalfa City as the battlefield for the decisive battle with the eastern region. Therefore, when faced with Jason's expectant eyes, Colin still coldly refused. "Jason, say sorry to Knight Ron for me. This time, I have an important matter to attend to and need to rush to Silvermoon City as soon as possible. I really can't go to Alfalfa City. If there is a chance next time, I will pay a visit." Lord Count. When he heard that Colin refused his invitation, Jason immediately became anxious. "You can't just ignore Alfalfa City. Capone, that damned bandit, has already gathered most of the underground forces of Alfalfa City. Our Loot family is alone, and without the support of the army, how can we fight against them? To tell you the truth, in the past 3 months, 3 knights and 2 rangers of the family have died for unknown reasons. If you don't care, I'm afraid that even father will be killed by those lunatics." Faced with Jason's sincere complaints, Colin's expression didn't change at all. He still said coldly, "I'm sorry, but Alfalfa City is a territory of the Half-Elf Kingdom. As the Count of the Northern Frontier, I have no authority to govern it. If your Loot family really has difficulties that you can't solve, you can go to Queen Aisha. Lord Count, Her Majesty the Queen is also unwilling to send troops to support Alfalfa City." "Then I can't do anything." Colin spread out his hands and said to Knight Roger, "Send Knight Jason away." Lord Count, Jason still wanted to persuade him, but Knight Roger had already forcefully dragged him out. Colin watched as Jason struggled to be driven out. He rubbed his chin and pondered for a moment. Then, he quickly wrote a letter, summoned an attendant, and ordered, "My lord, I've been waiting for a long time." He ordered, "Immediately send this letter to Winter City and hand it over to Arnold of the Northern Wind Merchant Association." Yes. Although Colin couldn't march into Alfalfa City now, he wasn't willing to do nothing and let the forces of the eastern region wreak havoc there. Chapter 362. After passing through the Shadow Canyon, the Blood Cavalry went all the way to the north. After traveling for another 2 days, the Sentinel Cavalry actually brought another roadblock to Colin. However, Colin didn't refuse the invitation this time. Because it was Queen Aisha's handwriting on the invitation. "Knight Roger, speed up. We'll rest in Red Maple Manor tonight." "Yes, sir." With this order, the Blood Cavalry began to speed up and finally arrived at Red Maple Manor in the southern suburbs of Silvermoon City before sunset. The afterglow of the setting sun shone on the flame-like maple leaves, making the scene unreal. Colin had a deep impression of this manor because he had escorted Vera to pass by here a year ago. Moreover, the two of them had left behind a beautiful memory here. Unexpectedly, when Colin passed by Red Maple Manor for the second time, he found Queen Aisha waiting for him here. The beautiful scenery of the sunset and maple leaves was not as attractive to Colin as the beautiful figure at the entrance of the manor. After a long time, Queen Aisha's belly had swelled up, but her face was still as delicate as before. As a female knight, of course, Aisha wouldn't have any pregnancy reactions like normal pregnant women. She wouldn't feel nauseous or vomit, and her body wouldn't become bloated or out of shape either. Only the unconcealable radiance of motherhood made the elegant and beautiful half-elf queen seem more gentle and approachable. Why don't you stay in Silvermoon City? Why are you running around with such a big belly? Colin got off the horse, stepped forward and said in a slightly reproachful tone. Queen Aisha smiled and said in a sweet voice, I'm just here to relax. The red maple forest in this season is a rare beautiful scenery in the world. Colin didn't want to be too harsh on the woman who was about to give birth to his child. He walked side by side with her into the manor and said, then I'll accompany you to see the maple leaves. Okay, the banquet will take a while. Hearing this, the crowd around immediately dispersed quietly, giving enough privacy to the two people who had not seen each other for a long time. Feeling neglected, Princess Judy also wanted to follow, but she was stopped by Prince Harrison. Initially, Colin had only planned to bring Prince Harrison along, but he didn't expect Princess Judy to shamelessly insist on tagging along. Colin was worried that the incident with Joyce would traumatize the little girl, so he brought her along as a way to let her relax. However, Judy's lively and carefree attitude made Colin feel that he was worried for nothing. Why are you stopping me? Judy glared at her brother, baring her fangs and brandishing her claws. Teacher has something important to discuss with Queen Aisha. Why are you following them? Something important? Who would talk about important matters as soon as they met? Moreover, he didn't even greet us. How rude. Judy shouted, unconvinced. Maybe Queen Aisha didn't see us. Furthermore, we're here as students and teachers. Her Majesty doesn't have to welcome us like royalty. Anyway, it's too much. Judy still looked angry. Then, she looked at Colin and Aisha's departing figures, and seemed to realize something. She whispered mysteriously, Hey, brother, do you know something? Teacher and Queen Aisha don't seem to have a normal relationship. No. No. Don't make wild guesses. Harrison shook his head guiltily. Actually, he wasn't sure himself. When Queen Medela brought him to the half-elf queen's coronation, he had indeed guessed that Aisha's child might be Colin's. However, after the incident with Joyce, Harrison already had respect for Colin. Naturally, he didn't dare to make wild guesses about his teacher's secret. Only Judy rolled her big bright eyes, as if she was scheming something. When is the due date? About half a month. Queen Aisha was wearing a loose white silk dress. She had one hand on her bulging belly and the other holding Colin's arm as they strolled through the fiery red maple forest. Her beautiful and charming face shone with the radiance of happiness. Her green eyes were filled with tenderness as she looked at her lover. Have the necessary preparations been made? Don't worry, they're all done. Colin's worry was actually a little unnecessary. As the half-elf queen, how could Aisha not have anyone to help her with something as important as giving birth? Moreover, as a blood descendant, Aisha's life wouldn't be in danger even if her heart was pierced. Thus, giving birth was nothing to worry about. Even if she encountered a difficult birth, Colin was confident that he could command the doctors to successfully perform a C-section for Aisha in this era where medical technology was lacking. Of course, Colin definitely didn't want Aisha to suffer like this. It was best if everything went smoothly. Did you meet the people of the Lute family when you came? Yes. Colin nodded. Did they also look for you? Queen Aisha nodded. That's right. However, I remember you saying that now is not the best time for the military to intervene in Alfalfa City, so I refused them. You did the right thing. However, the Lute family's current situation is really not good. Without outside support, I estimate that it won't be long before they are driven out of Alfalfa City. Queen Aisha frowned slightly. It seems that I have to continue looking for the next city lord. Colin squeezed Queen Aisha's soft little hand and comforted her. Don't worry, I already have a plan. Oh. Looking at Aisha's curious face, Colin shook his head and deliberately kept her in suspense. You'll understand after a while. Aisha nodded and didn't ask any more questions. She was still very confident in Colin. The two chatted as they walked. They passed by a well made of white glazed rock with a sapling planted in it. Colin curiously asked, Why is this maple tree surrounded? I planted it myself 2 days ago. Aisha softly said, her face full of motherly radiance, to commemorate our child that is about to be born. Colin looked at the young sapling and his heart trembled. An inexplicable feeling welled up in his heart as he said, "Can I touch it?" Aisha knew that Colin was talking about the child in her belly. She smiled and nodded, of course. Colin looked at Aisha's bright and beautiful face and slowly hugged her from behind. Aisha leaned on Colin's body and held his hands, gently pressing them against her abdomen. Colin could feel Aisha's soft and delicate skin through the soft and smooth silk fabric. Her weak but firm heartbeat clearly fell into his palm. This kind of heartbeat caused Colin to be momentarily dazed. This little life was connected to his bloodline and was an extension of his life. It proved that his existence in this world was real and not fabricated. As a visitor from another world, Colin had always felt a vague sense of estrangement from this world. It was as if he didn't truly belong here. Only now did Colin finally feel a sense of belonging as he listened to the heartbeat of the little life in Aisha's belly. For a moment, his heart was calm and filled with strength. Suddenly, Colin thought of a question: as the child of him and his bloodline, would this child also be a member of the blood race? At the thought of this, Colin felt an inexplicable sense of anticipation. Chapter 363. Early morning, Red Maple Manor. Queen Aisha opened her eyes and found that her lover was no longer by her side, leaving only a breath that she was infatuated with. After lying on the comfortable bed for a while, Aisha gently stroked her bulging belly, a happy and sweet smile appearing on her beautiful face. "Good morning, baby." After gently greeting the little life in her belly, Aisha left the bed and walked out of the bedroom barefooted. She saw Colin sitting at the desk in the front hall, holding a roll of parchment and looking at it in a daze. Colin heard the movement behind him and turned his head to see Aisha in a loose nightgown. He smiled and said, "Dear, did I wake you up? You should sleep more. Also, pregnant women need to keep warm. You can't run around the house barefooted." Queen Aisha rolled her beautiful eyes and walked forward to sit on Colin's lap. She used her delicate red lips to stop her lover's nagging. After a moment of tenderness, Aisha curiously looked at the parchment on the table and asked, "What are you looking at?" "I'm looking at the report that Duke Modwin wrote for you." Aisha did not mind that Colin was flipping through the letter that her vassal wrote for her. Instead, she giggled and said, "Duke Modwin is anxious. Hee, isn't it all because you refused to go back to Red Maple Manor?" Colin raised his eyebrows and patted Aisha's smooth and delicate thigh lightly. After patting it, he also laughed. Perhaps he was thinking of Duke Modwin, who was simple and honest but had no ability. Queen Aisha leaned softly on Colin's chest and felt his vigorous heartbeat. She smiled and asked, "Then do you think I should return to Silvermoon City immediately?" Colin glanced at the beautiful smile of the woman in his arms and shook his head. "No, let Duke Modwin continue to be anxious for a while." "What reason should I use this time?" Queen Aisha asked with a smile. "Previously, I could say that I did not see you. But now that you have arrived at Red Maple Manor, how should I reply to Duke Modwin?" Colin pondered for a moment and said, "Just say that the carriage is broken and is being repaired." How could there be such a coincidence? Queen Aisha pouted, a little dissatisfied with this idea. Colin had no choice but to change his excuse. "Then you can say that I don't want you to suffer from the bumpy ride, so I'm preparing to design a new shock absorber for your carriage." "You really know how to design a carriage's shock absorber?" Queen Aisha's eyes lit up as she smiled at her lover. "Of course it's true. I already have a wonderful idea." Colin pretended to be confident. In fact, he was thinking of a spring, but he didn't know if the craftsmen of this era could make a spring, so he felt a little guilty. However, he decided to give it a try later. After all, he had nothing else to do. He also knew that Queen Aisha specially came to Red Maple Manor this time. Firstly, she wanted to see her lover earlier. Secondly, she wanted to give the half-elves in Silvery Moon City a chance so that they could plan their own schemes without worry when the queen was not around. In the past 2 years, Queen Aisha had inevitably offended a group of half-elven nobles in order to control the half-elven kingdom. Moreover, she had angered almost all the half-elven merchants because of the low price she had given to the northern frontier. Although these half-elven nobles and merchants seemed to be obedient to Queen Aisha on the surface, they had secretly colluded and plotted to overthrow Queen Aisha's rule. That was why Colin had brought the blood cavalry to the half-elven kingdom this time. It was to completely wipe out the rebel forces in the half-elven kingdom. Do you think that Duke Modwin has joined the rebel forces? Colin suddenly asked playfully. To be honest, I can't guess either. Queen Aisha picked up the sheepskin parchment on the table and flipped through the information that Duke Modwin had reported to her recently. The sincerity and loyalty in it did not seem fake at all. The House of Medea was once the half-elven royal family. Logically speaking, they have enough motive to rebel against my rule. However, William, this person. Perhaps it is as you said before. An honest person's lies are harder to detect. The face of the honest Prince William appeared in Colin's mind. He said, so you let Duke Modwin take charge of the situation in Silvery Moon City? That's right. Since I can't figure out his loyalty, I might as well place him in the most crucial position. If Duke Modwin can still withstand the test under such circumstances, then I can completely trust him in the future. Aren't you afraid that you will go overboard and let the rebel forces completely control Silvery Moon City? With you around, how can I go overboard? Queen Aisha stretched out her pink arms and hooked Colin's neck as she smiled seductively. Colin laughed. His confidence was greatly satisfied. He immediately used his mouth to capture Queen Aisha's red lips. The faint fragrance and slight sweetness were unforgettable as always. After a long while, their lips parted. Colin patted Aisha's smooth arm and said, "Are you hungry? Let's go have breakfast." Aisha immediately stood up from Colin's arms and tidied her messy hair. Then, she held her lover's arm and walked out openly. Ha! I knew it. Your relationship is indeed not ordinary. As soon as they walked out, a petite figure suddenly jumped out from the corner of the wall and shouted while pointing at Colin and Aisha. Colin, who had been caught red-handed, chuckled as he looked at the smug Princess Judy and Prince Harrison, who was hiding behind the pillar in the corridor. He calmly greeted, "Good morning, Princess Judy." Judy saw that Colin and Aisha weren't as panicked as she had expected, and her interest was instantly dampened. She put her hands on her hips and questioned, Teacher, I didn't expect Queen Aisha to be your lover. So? Colin had a fearless look on his face. Judy puffed up her cheeks. She hesitated for a moment but didn't say anything. However, her eyes kept glancing at Aisha's bulging belly. Her meaning was obvious. However, Colin didn't seem to understand the little girl's hint. He smiled and said, "Let's go and have breakfast." After saying that, he put his arm around Queen Aisha's waist and walked towards the dining hall. "Teacher, you. Judy panicked. She felt that her teacher was too careless. Although it wasn't a big deal for nobles to have lovers, Queen Aisha's identity was special. Furthermore, she was pregnant now. If people suspected that the child in her belly was Colin's illegitimate child, it would definitely severely weaken the legitimacy of her inheritance. It was a pity that the little girl was still too young. She couldn't understand Colin and Aisha's plan. If it had been a year ago, Colin definitely wouldn't have been so intimate with Queen Aisha in public. But now, as the Earl of the Empire and the guardian of the northern frontier, he didn't have to hide it anymore. He even hoped that some rumors would spread to Silvermoon City. It would give those conspirators more excuses and courage. This way, he could get rid of the rebellious forces in the half-elven kingdom once and for all. As for the issue of the inheritance of the child in Queen Aisha's belly, in the face of absolute power, it wasn't a problem at all. As long as Colin and Aisha insisted that the child was the old king's posthumous child, who would dare to refute them? Teacher, teacher. You have to be careful. Judy hurriedly chased after him and advised anxiously. Unfortunately, Colin didn't care about his student's good intentions. He still had his arm around Queen Aisha as he strode forward. Chapter 364. Early morning, Alfalfa City's City Lord's mansion. Ron pushed away the strange woman wrapped in a sheet beside him. His eyes swept past her exposed white skin, but he didn't stop. However, the woman seemed to be unsatisfied and continued to pester him coquettishly. Ding! It wasn't until Ron threw a few silver coins that the woman stopped pestering him. She put on her clothes with a smile and left the room. Ron rubbed his slightly swollen head and put on his nightgown. He went to the bedroom's floor-to-ceiling window and pulled open the huge curtains. The sun was shining brightly outside the window. It was another beautiful morning. Unfortunately, Ron's mood couldn't be good. It had been almost half a year since Queen Aisha appointed him as the City Lord of Alfalfa City. Ron's hot blood had been extinguished by the cold reality. He originally thought that this was an opportunity to revitalize the Lute family, but now it seemed that this was simply a bottomless pit. This pit had swallowed almost all of Ron's enthusiasm and hope. Perhaps it would continue to swallow the Lute family's glory and even their inheritance. In the past, even if the Lute family had been stripped of their title by Queen Aisha because of their participation in the Savoy family's rebellion, Ron wouldn't touch those dirty and lowly commoner women. But now, Ron had given up on himself. Even if the noble bloodline of the Lute family flowed out to those lowly commoners, it was still better than being cut off. Dong dong. The door was gently knocked twice, and Ron responded softly. Immediately, an old maid came in with a noble's robe and began to dress Ron. The maid's actions were a little rough. Ron frowned, but he didn't say anything. With the Lute family's current situation, they could no longer afford young, beautiful, and clever maids. Ron was worried that if he scolded the maid in front of him and made her run away, no one would help him dress in the future. This was actually a very serious problem for nobles because nobles' robes were very troublesome. Without the help of a servant, there was no way to wear them. Many commoners liked to tease that stupid nobles don't even know how to wear their own clothes. But in fact, if they really tried on a noble's robe, they would be completely dumbfounded. Just as Ron was enduring the maid's rough hands and feet, the door was knocked again. Soon after, his son, Jason, strode in and reported, "I'm sorry. Father, a caravan from the northern frontier entered Alfalfa City last night." Caravan? From the northern frontier? Yes. Ron's brows furrowed tightly as if he couldn't believe that a caravan would dare to come to Alfalfa City. Alfalfa City was a city of chaos sandwiched between the northern frontier, the eastern region, and the half-elf kingdom. It had always been a haven for criminals. Therefore, although its geographical location was very good and suitable as a transit point for cross-border trade, as long as a businessman was sane, he would not choose to pass through here. Could it be that it was some hothead who didn't know the situation in Alfalfa City and had recklessly barged in? Which chamber of commerce are they from? How many are there? This caravan doesn't have a banner, so I don't know which chamber of commerce they belong to. However, there aren't many people in their caravan. There are only about 10 of them, and there's also an unknown mercenary team escorting them. There are less than 100 people in total. They really do seem like hotheads, Ron thought. They actually dared to do cross-border trade with so few people. Even if they didn't go through Alfalfa City, they would probably be targeted by bandit groups at the chaotic border. Forget it, don't worry about them. Ron waved his hand casually. In his heart, he had already regarded this caravan as dead people. Jason hesitated for a moment, but still reminded him, "Father, do you still remember the information we just received about the northern frontier?" "What information?" "It's the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company established by Count Angeli." According to the orders issued by the Duke of St. Hilda, only this company can carry out foreign trade in the northern frontier. Ron only reacted when he heard this. So this was a smuggling caravan. No wonder they didn't have a banner, and no wonder they had to go through Alfalfa City. Only in this chaos city could they avoid being searched by the Northern Frontier Border Patrol and carry out foreign trade privately. Seeing that his father's expression changed, Jason suggested, "Father, we should send people to control this caravan and find out who's behind them. Then, we can escort them to Silvermoon City. This way, Queen Aisha and Count Angeli will definitely be very satisfied. The support you've always wanted may be available." Ron listened to his son's suggestion. Not only was he not moved, but he also frowned. After thinking for a while, he slowly opened his mouth and asked, "Do you think a small smuggling caravan can exchange for Queen Aisha or Count Angeli's support for Alfalfa City?" Jason was suddenly speechless. In fact, he also understood the awkward situation Alfalfa City was in. He knew that no matter if it was Count Angeli or Queen Aisha, under the current circumstances, they wouldn't really send troops into the city to help the Loot family. A small smuggling caravan obviously couldn't change the overall situation. "There's nothing wrong with trying, right?" Jason said unwillingly. Ron shook his head. A trace of craftiness flashed through his eyes as he said, "No, we shouldn't capture this caravan. Instead, we should allow them to pass through Alfalfa City. We should even secretly provide them with a little convenience." "Why?" Jason obviously didn't follow his father's train of thought. He was suddenly a little dumbfounded. "It's useless even if you capture a small smuggling caravan. Queen Aisha and Count Angeli may casually reward you with some insignificant things, but they definitely won't send an army to Alfalfa City. However, what if Alfalfa City becomes a holy land of smuggling between the northern frontier and the outside world?" Jason's eyes lit up. He finally came back to his senses and immediately said, "Then Count Angeli definitely won't sit idly by." "That's right." Ron smiled and nodded. He said complacently, "The Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company is involved with such a huge interest. If we allow these smuggling caravans to converge in Alfalfa City and continuously poach the company's business, it will damage the prestige of the House of St. Hilda. At that time, will Count Angeli still be able to hold back and not care about Alfalfa City?" Jason also became excited. He seemed to be able to see the prosperous scene of Alfalfa City becoming a holy land of smuggling. However, he immediately asked with slight worry, "But father, if we sit idly by and watch the smuggling caravans pass through Alfalfa City unimpeded, will Count Angeli blame the Loot family for this? What can we do?" Ron spread out his hands and said with a smile, "Although I am the city lord of Alfalfa City in name, everyone knows that the real master of this city is someone else. Even if Count Angeli blames us, we have a reason to shirk responsibility." Jason nodded and said in agreement, "Okay, father. I will send people to keep an eye on that caravan to prevent some blind fellows from making a move on them." Ron stopped his son and asked with a sneer, "If the Alfalfa Brotherhood really wants to make a move on that caravan, will you be able to protect them?" Jason suddenly froze on the spot. Although he didn't want to admit it, the current order of Alfalfa City was indeed in the hands of the Alfalfa Brotherhood. Their Loot family, as an official force, couldn't protect them. "Then, what should we do?" Jason asked somewhat gloomily. "We don't have to do anything," Ron said faintly. Seeing his son's puzzled face, he asked in reply, "Where do you think this caravan's destination is?" To come to Alfalfa City from the northern frontier, they could only go to the Half-Elf Kingdom or the eastern region. However, Jason rolled his eyes and instantly understood his father's meaning. He immediately said, "They should be going to the eastern region." "That's right." Ron nodded and said with a smile, "So, as long as this caravan isn't stupid, they must have already informed the eastern region. Since they dared to go through Alfalfa City, it means that the Alfalfa Brotherhood should have received the information in advance. At most, they will collect some toll from them and won't really make a move on them, *knock, knock, knock. Asterisk at this moment, someone knocked on the door again. Ron responded. Then, he saw his sheriff walk in and report, "Sir, I'm sorry. Sir, a merchant just came to report a case." Ron's heart skipped a beat and he hurriedly asked, "Is it the people of the caravan that entered the city last night?" "Yes." "What case did they report?" "They said that something important was stolen from the caravan last night." Chapter 365. Did you hear about it? What did you hear? In a dark alley in Alfalfa City, unclean sewage flowed along the terrain, forming puddles that emitted a foul stench. Rats slowly walked through the garbage pile in the corner, and the rotten smell permeated the air. In such an unbearably bad environment, several young men in tattered shirts gathered together and excitedly shared the new happenings in the city. The caravan that entered the city last night, sure enough, it was stolen. Of course. I really can't figure it out. Why would a caravan dare to come to Alfalfa City? Are they looking down on the city of chaos? Do you know who did it? It should be Orlando's men. How many thieves in this city aren't his men? What did they steal? I don't know, but it's just petty theft. How much can they steal? If you ask me, we should do something big. Let's loot that caravan together. Agreed. Agreed. I agree too. What's the use of your agreement? We have to get Boss Capone's approval first, a short and fat young man with meticulously combed hair said disdainfully. Hearing this, everyone was somewhat silent. Recently, as the Alfalfa Brotherhood's president, Capone, after gradually taking control of the situation in Alfalfa City, began to restrain his subordinates. He didn't let them burn, kill, loot, and commit all kinds of crimes like before. According to Capone, we are about to become the masters of this city. How can a master wantonly ruin his own home? From this sentence, one could see Capone's ambition. But this wasn't surprising. Every dark force would want to wash their hands when they reached a certain stage of development. It was just that such restrictions made the various forces in the Alfalfa Brotherhood somewhat conflicted. If it weren't for Capone's tyrannical strength and high prestige in Alfalfa City, the Alfalfa Brotherhood might have fought among themselves. Seeing that everyone had fallen silent, the man asked in a joking tone, "Did you know that the manager of the caravan actually went to the city lord's mansion to report the case?" "I'm dying of laughter, report the case." The others were suddenly amused, as if they had heard the funniest joke in the world. "Instead of looking for that cowardly city lord, you might as well look for our boss Capone." Boss Capone wouldn't care about such trivial matters. As soon as he said this, a man hurried over and said breathlessly, "Have you seen Harry?" "Harry? I didn't see him. What's wrong?" "This kid stole something from the caravan entering the city. Boss Capone is looking for him." Hearing this, the few of them looked at each other in disbelief. They had just said that Capone wouldn't care about such a small matter, but they were immediately slapped in the face. It wasn't until the person who asked the question ran away in a hurry that they recovered from the shock and confusion. "Why do you think? Why would boss ask about this?" "I'm afraid Harry stole a lot of valuable things." This seemed to be the only possible answer. Realizing this, their breathing became heavy, and their eyes flashed with unconcealable greed. "Since boss is looking for Harry, how can we not help?" Yes, let's look for it together." Alfalfa City wasn't a city full of warmth. On the contrary, indifference was the normal atmosphere here. But today, the enthusiasm of the entire city had been aroused. Almost everyone knew that the caravan entering the city last night had been stolen, and that Boss Capone was looking for the thief who had done it. Although Capone didn't say why he was looking for a thief, this didn't prevent everyone from cleverly thinking that this thief must have stolen a huge sum of money. Otherwise, how could it have attracted Boss Capone's attention? Similarly, this had attracted the attention of the entire city. In this depraved city full of scum and villains, there was no one who didn't love money. Even if they knew that this wealth shouldn't be something they could touch, if it really appeared in front of them and was at their fingertips, perhaps not many people would be able to resist such a temptation. For a moment, Alfalfa City was surging like a storm. In a dimly lit room, a middle-aged man with a dark complexion was sitting with a cold expression. He wasn't tall, only a little over 1.6 meters. After sitting down, he seemed even shorter, but the whole room was shrouded in this person's aura. Capone, a fifth-rank warrior and the president of the Alfalfa Brotherhood. It was said that behind him stood a big shot from the eastern region. Now, Alfalfa City was under the control of this person. On the right side of Capone stood a tall and skinny half-elf with a serious expression. His name was Orlando. This half-elf was quite famous in Alfalfa City, and could be called the ancestor of all thieves in the city. Only, this ancestor of thieves was currently in a very bad mood. "These are the things you stole." Capone coldly stared at the young thief kneeling in front of him and questioned. "Yes, sir. Apart from the gold coin I used to drink yesterday, the rest are all here." The young thief's complexion was pale, and his body couldn't help but shiver. His teeth chattered as they chattered. But Capone obviously didn't believe the words of the thief. He sneered and said, "I'll give you one more chance. Apart from the gold coin, what else did you take? As long as you give it to me, I can guarantee your safety in Alfalfa City. Otherwise, hee." Large beads of sweat appeared on the forehead of the young thief. He couldn't wipe it clean no matter how hard he tried. He raised his left hand and made a nondescript oath, saying, "Sir, I can swear to the God of Radiance that the things I stole last night are all here. Apart from the gold coins, I didn't take anything else." Capone laughed and was about to open his mouth when Orlando finally couldn't help but say, "Sir Capone, if you want to punish my people, you should at least give a proper reason, right? What did he take that he shouldn't have taken, and even alarmed you?" Capone shot a glance at Orlando. He knew that his behavior had already aroused the dissatisfaction of this ancestor of thieves. Although Orlando's forces were also affiliated with the Alfalfa Brotherhood, and it was reasonable to say that Capone was certainly qualified to interrogate the thief in front of him. But as Orlando said, if Capone made a big fuss just because the other party stole some gold coins from a passing caravan, then it would definitely be a provocation to Orlando's authority. Capone was nominally the president of the Alfalfa Brotherhood, but this organization was formed by the union of various underground forces in Alfalfa City. There were many factions among them, and Capone couldn't really ignore the thoughts of those small leaders. So, he hesitated for a moment and said to Orlando, "Do you know about the bonds recently issued by the House of St. Hilda?" "Bonds? I've heard a little about it. It's said that these things are now causing quite a stir in the northern frontier." Orlando nodded, and then realized something. His face suddenly changed and he asked, could it be that the things the caravan lost, in addition to the gold coins, were also these bonds? "That's right," Capone said with a dignified expression, "and it's not a small amount." "How much?" Orlando asked bitterly. "Let's put it this way, these bonds are worth more than the entire Alfalfa City." Orlando opened his mouth wide, and his face was full of disbelief. You're not joking, right? Do I look like I'm joking?" Capone sneered and revealed, "These bonds are something that a certain big shot in the eastern region wants." Orlando, are you sure you can bear the consequences?" Orlando's face instantly turned deathly pale. The young thief kneeling in front of the two was about to faint from the shock of this news. A majestic urge to pee continuously attacked his fragile nerves, and he screamed, "Sir Capone, Sir Orlando, you must believe me. I really didn't take any bonds, I don't even know these damn bonds." Capone snorted and urged, "Orlando, what are you waiting for?" Orlando's face changed for a while, and finally he sighed and said coldly, "Let's begin the punishment." Chapter 366. In the end, what kind of person could withstand the torture of a confession? Had he undergone special training? Did he not feel pain? Or did he have some kind of undying belief? In any case, this young thief did not belong to any of the above categories. Therefore, Harry could not bear it any longer. He confessed all the filthy things he had done since he was young. Unfortunately, this was not what Capone wanted to hear. Thus, the torture continued. The Alfalfa Brotherhood had no bottom line at all. In order to make Harry speak, they used all kinds of methods. Not long after, this poor thief was tortured to the point that he did not look human anymore. 2 hooks used to hang pork were passed under his collarbone, hanging him up. His whole body was covered with bloody whip marks. One of his eyeballs had been dug out, and the place where his nose used to be had become a bloody hole. A long wooden stick with thorns was stuffed into his buttocks. Harry fainted several times, but was immediately awakened by the burning of the soldering iron. It was only when the executioner held a knife with a cold glint and was about to cut off a certain male feature between Harry's legs that he finally collapsed. "Sir Capone, I'll speak, I'll speak." Capone expressionlessly signaled to the executioner, then said to Harry, "Speak, my patience is limited." At this time, Harry could no longer care about anything. In order to get out of this hell, he could only make the wisest choice, to shift the blame. "My lord, Brew was with me last night. I didn't see any bonds at all. It must be this kid who stole it, it must be him." Blue. Capone frowned, but this time, he did not question the words of the thief in front of him. If it was really the other party who stole the bonds, he would have admitted it long ago. He would not have waited until he was almost half a cripple before he was willing to speak. Thus, Capone looked at Orlando. Orlando nodded and said, "I'll go find Blue." Blue tried hard to open his sleepy eyes, but found that there was only a blurry shadow in front of his eyes. After getting drunk last night, he went to find a certain skilled woman to fight a few hundred rounds. Now, his whole body was light as a feather, and his consciousness was not sober at all. But soon, he was forced to sober up. Crash! Brew felt as if a basin of cold water had been poured over his head. He shuddered, and the shadow in front of him finally took shape. Then, he recognized Orlando. "Father!" Brew shouted as if he had found someone to rely on. Orlando was actually not Brew's father. To be precise, he was not his biological father. There were many orphans in Alfalfa City who had no parents. Their best fate was to be adopted by a big shot of a region as an adopted son. Of course, this so-called adopted son could not be compared to the adopted sons of nobles who had the right of inheritance. Orlando didn't have anything for his adopted son to inherit. He adopted orphans, of course, not out of kindness. He just wanted some younger brothers who would work for him. Therefore, there were more than 300 adopted children like Blue in Orlando. Therefore, Brew's shout didn't cause any ripples in Orlando's heart. He looked at his adopted son expressionlessly and said coldly, "Don't worry." "Blue, were you with Harry last night?" "Yes, father. Last night, I was outside helping Harry keep a lookout. He went in to steal something and then gave me a gold coin." "Keep a lookout?" Orlando frowned. "You didn't go in to take something yourself?" Brew hurriedly shook his head like a rattle drum. "No." Capone was sitting at the side. When he heard this, he snorted impatiently to urge Brew. Orlando squatted in front of Brew, took out a bond, and asked in what he thought was a gentle and cordial tone, "Brew, tell father, did you take this thing?" "Father, I didn't enter the residence of the caravan at all." Brew shook his head repeatedly, then glanced at the bond in Orlando's hand and denied it more firmly. "Really, father, I've never seen the thing in your hand." Orlando's eyes finally turned cold, and his patience was gradually exhausted. He asked for the last time, "My child, you don't know the true value of this thing at all. This is not something you can covet. Even I don't dare to touch it. Hand it over, and Capone and I can guarantee your safety. We can even give you a sum of money enough for you to squander for a lifetime. But if you continue to be stubborn, then don't blame me for not respecting the relationship between father and son. Father, I'm really telling the truth. You must believe me. Brue hugged Orlando's thigh and wailed. It must be Harry who stole it. He framed me. It must be so. You can interrogate Harry. Orlando's face gradually stiffened, and a burst of anger ignited in his chest. He kicked Bruce to the ground and growled, "Don't worry, Bruce. We've already interrogated Harry. Now, it's your turn." After that, he nodded to the eager executioner, then turned his head, as if he couldn't bear to watch. "Father. Father. You must believe me. Ah. Save me. Ah. Ah." Mournful screams echoed in the room. The smell of blood mixed with the smell of feces and urine gradually diffused. Alfalfa City Lord's Mansion. "Father, I've inquired clearly. The caravan that entered the city belongs to the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce." Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce? Ron had naturally heard of this Chamber of Commerce. After all, the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce was the largest chamber of commerce in the northern frontier. Moreover, he had also heard that the president of the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce, Arnold, had some disagreements with Count Angeli because of the establishment of the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company. What was stolen from the caravan? Have you investigated clearly? Ron asked again. I've investigated clearly. It's said to be a huge amount of bonds. Is it the kind of bonds that the House of St. Hilda recently issued? That's right. Hee. Ron smiled faintly. It seems that when they came to report the case, they didn't tell the truth. When the people of the caravan came to the Public Security Office to report this morning, they only said that they had lost some gold coins and important documents. The caravan probably didn't dare to tell the truth. After all, the value of the bonds is huge. Even Capone has been alarmed and is personally investigating. Jason said with certainty. The Alfalfa Brotherhood was a loose organization that didn't have any confidentiality to speak of. The moment Capone told Orlando about this matter, the news immediately leaked out. Ron didn't speak anymore and just paced back and forth in the room. He suddenly felt that this matter wasn't as simple as it seemed on the surface. How could the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce come to Alfalfa City with such a huge amount of bonds? Who was the person they were trading with? The reason why Capone was so nervous, was it because of the huge value of the bonds that moved him? Or was it because of the big shot behind him in the eastern region? Of course, the most important thing was, what kind of impact would this matter bring to Alfalfa City? Jason saw that Ron hadn't spoken, so he couldn't help but feel anxious. He took the initiative to ask, "Father, what should we do?" Ron pondered for a long time and then said, "Immediately go to the Red Maple Manor and inform Count Angeli about this matter." Jason scratched the back of his head and said with some hesitation, "Father, didn't you say that we should condone these merchants from the northern frontier coming to Alfalfa City to smuggle? Why did you take the initiative to alarm Count Angeli now?" "Because, there's a problem with this Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce." Ron said in a deep voice, "Don't ask any more questions. Leave immediately." "Yes." Jason had no choice but to suppress the doubts in his heart and turned around to leave. Chapter 367. In the dark room, screams that made one's heart palpitate kept coming. As time went by, the screams gradually became weak, as if they were going to be cut off completely in the next second. At first, Capone was watching the execution with interest, but gradually, he began to become impatient. He thought it was a very simple matter, but he didn't expect that the two thieves he had never taken seriously would give him a big surprise. "Orlando, are all of your subordinates so courageous?" Capone asked the thief ancestor beside him in annoyance. Orlando lowered his head at this time. No one knew what he was thinking, and he didn't respond to Capone's ridicule. Brue, who had been brutally tortured, was on the verge of death. This hellish experience had transformed his initial feelings of grievance and confusion into his current feelings of anger and despair. It also made him understand a lot of things. He knew that no matter how he defended himself or told the truth, no one would be willing to believe him. Compared to the priceless bonds, the life of a thief like him was not worth mentioning at all. But Brue was unwilling. Harry's framing, Capone's indifference, Orlando's indifference. Finally, Brue's mentality completely darkened. Feeling his vitality fading away bit by bit, Brue's eyes flashed with the brutality of a dying lone wolf. At this moment, he only wanted to destroy everything in front of him and let this city of sin be buried with him. Water. Water. Hearing Brue's weak voice, Capone, who was about to give up, suddenly had his eyes lit up. You finally figured it out. Brue nodded slowly, trying to hide the resentment in his eyes. Capone was delighted and said, put him down and give him water. Orlando finally recovered from his silence. He turned around and looked at Brue, who was no longer in a human shape. There was more or less a trace of guilt in his heart, but it was soon replaced by an inexplicable anger. You were the one who took it, so why did you wait until now to confess? Not only did you harm yourself, but you also made me lose face in front of Capone. However, Orlando also knew that he had to show enough warmth at this time. He hurriedly stepped forward to help Brue sit up, and personally fed him water. After drinking some water, Brue was finally able to catch his breath. However, he knew that he didn't have much longer to live. The hypocrisy of this adoptive father in front of him only made him feel more disgusted than ever. Father, I'm sorry. I've let you down. However, Brue expressed a strong sense of admiration. This made Orlando feel guilty again, and he said sincerely, Brue, don't worry. As long as you tell me where the bonds are hidden, I'll immediately get a priest to heal you. Capone looked at the scene of a filial son and father, and felt disdain in his heart. However, he did not step forward to disturb them. Right now, he only wanted to find the bonds and end this matter. Blue nodded as if he was finally willing to confess. He leaned close to Orlando's ear and whispered in a soft voice, Father, those bonds are hidden in. His lips moved, and his voice became extremely low and indistinct. Capone couldn't help but take a few steps closer, wanting to listen carefully. However, Bruce suddenly raised his head, grinned at Capone, and said hatefully, You'll never get those bonds. That's the last gift I left for Father. After saying this, a trace of relief and pleasure flashed across Bruce's face. Then, under the shocked gazes of Capone and Orlando, he crashed into the execution rack behind him. The sharp blade on the shelf easily pierced through Bruce's neck. His eyes rolled back, and he stopped breathing. Capone was stunned for a moment, then he immediately growled at Orlando, who was squatting foolishly, Damn it. What did that kid say to you? Where are the bonds hidden? Orlando didn't seem to have recovered from the series of changes in front of him. When he heard this, he only replied subconsciously, But I didn't hear anything clearly just now. You didn't hear clearly? Capone's face suddenly turned ferocious. He grabbed Orlando's collar, pulled him up from the ground, and roared, Orlando, do you really think I'm a fool? Or do you also want to have a taste of these punishments? Orlando was also angry, but he also knew that he wasn't Capone's opponent. He felt wronged, like a girl who had just been raped, and loudly defended himself. I'm telling the truth. Brue didn't say anything just now. Can't you see through such a simple scam? Scam? Hee, Orlando, how do I know that you don't want to take the wealth for yourself? However, I have to warn you that these bonds are of great importance. It's not something a thief like you can covet. If you don't hand them over, don't even think about leaving Alfalfa City alive. In the face of Capone's threat, a long-suppressed anger rose in Orlando's heart. He immediately straightened his neck and roared, Capone. Do you really think you can run amok in Alfalfa City? Don't forget, you're just a newcomer who came here 3 years ago. If it weren't for someone supporting you from behind, do you really think we'd be willing to submit to you? I'm also warning you, don't go too far. Otherwise, the waters of Alfalfa City are definitely deeper than you can imagine. Capone was so angry that he laughed and kicked Orlando in the stomach. Orlando's subordinates, who were surrounding him, pulled out their long swords and glared at Capone. However, Capone didn't pay any attention to these people in the slightest. More than 10 years of carnage had long since forged his steel-like willpower. Moreover, as a rank 5 warrior, he also had extraordinary self-confidence and conceit. No one here could threaten him. Capone gloomily stared at Orlando, who had fallen to the ground, and said in a deep voice, "I don't care whether that kid lied or who stole the bonds. But as the person in charge of this city's thief organization, you must find these bonds. I'll give you 3 days. If I don't see these bonds within 3 days, you can just wait to collect your corpse." After saying that, Capone heavily snorted and squeezed his way out of the middle of Orlando's subordinates who were eyeing him covetously. After Capone left, Orlando was helped up. However, he immediately snatched the long sword from the hand of a person beside him and hacked at Blue's corpse as if venting his anger. It wasn't until Blue's corpse was cut into pieces and badly mutilated that Orlando stopped, gasping for breath. At this time, Orlando's heart was full of resentment and grievance. He was carrying this pot on his back for no reason at all. Moreover, he also realized that Blue, this kid, actually didn't forget to play a trick on him before he died. He really was his good son. After what he did, perhaps the whole city would soon know that the priceless bonds were in Orlando's hands. The key point was that he didn't know anything at all. More importantly, Orlando realized that if he couldn't take out anything to give to Capone, then what would he do after 3 days? The subordinates beside him seemed to have thought of this as well. They all focused their gazes on Orlando, waiting for his orders. Orlando muttered to himself for a long time before he finally gritted his teeth and said fiercely, "Does Capone really think that he can cover the sky with one hand in Alfalfa City? Come with me." After saying that, he took the lead and walked out. The subordinates looked at each other in dismay and hurriedly followed. Chapter 368. Red Maple Manor. The warm afternoon sun shone on the back garden, and the autumn rain that had just fallen added some fragrance to the air. Jason, who had hurried over from Alfalfa City, was led by the butler to see Colin and Aisha walking in the garden. However, the intimate posture of the two made Jason involuntarily lower his head, not daring to look. The ambiguous relationship between Count Angeli and Queen Aisha was no longer a secret in the half-elf kingdom. There were even some speculations about the father of the fetus in the queen's belly that had been spread by people with ulterior motives. Jason followed behind the butler and couldn't help but criticize in his mind. "Can't you two be more restrained in public? Your Majesty the Queen, Count Angeli, please allow me to represent all the members of the Lute family and all the people of Alfalfa City to express the highest respect to you." Queen Aisha glanced at Jason with a languid expression and said indifferently, "Can the Lute family now represent the people of Alfalfa City?" Faced with the sharp questioning of the queen, Jason suddenly froze on the spot, not knowing how to answer. Fortunately, Colin chuckled and said, "Knight Jason, it seems that your Lute family's current actions in Alfalfa City have not satisfied Her Majesty the Queen." "Yes. We have failed to live up to Her Majesty's expectations," Jason replied bitterly. Colin patted Aisha's arm and gave her a look. Aisha understood and then ignored Jason and continued to walk forward slowly. Colin stayed where he was and looked at the knight of the Lute family with a smile. He asked, "Knight Jason, what are you here for this time? Are you here to ask for support like last time?" "No, Count Angeli, this time I have an important matter to report." "Tell me." Jason recounted the matter of the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce entering Alfalfa City with a large amount of bonds, but it was stolen by a local thief. However, to his disappointment, Colin listened quietly without any expression on his face. It was as if such a thing could not attract his attention at all. Jason was anxious and hurriedly reminded, "Your Lordship, the North Wind Chamber of Commerce dares to send a caravan through Alfalfa City to engage in foreign trade. This is simply a provocation to the policies you've previously formulated." If you don't crack down on this kind of smuggling, there will definitely be other imitators in the future. Colin smiled. He looked at Jason with a playful expression and asked, then, as the city lord of Alfalfa City, does your father have the ability to help me crack down on these smuggled northern frontier merchants? For now. I can't. Jason was a little discouraged, but he immediately said, Your lordship, as long as you are willing to support us. Of course, I also know that you are worried about the natural moat that is the New Shui River. However, as long as you send troops to help us occupy one of the 3 districts of Alfalfa City, then our loot family will definitely be able to block off this smuggling route for you. However, Colin still firmly shook his head and said, as I said, now is not the time to send troops to Alfalfa City. Jason was still unwilling to give up and continued to persuade, Your lordship, this time, the North Wind Chamber of Commerce is still trying to transport a large amount of bonds out of the northern frontier. Aren't you worried about who the buyers of these bonds are? Of course not. Colin said calmly, when these bonds were first issued, his lordship clearly declared that no matter who it was, they could exchange food for the bonds. Moreover, when the bonds matured, they could also exchange them for food from the House of St. Hilda. The North Wind Chamber of Commerce used food to exchange for a large amount of bonds from the House of St. Hilda. Now, what they are going to do with these bonds and who they are going to sell them to has nothing to do with the House of St. Hilda or me. However, this time, the North Wind Chamber of Commerce is obviously preparing to trade such a large amount of bonds to the Eastern region. Your lordship, aren't you worried about the Eastern region's conspiracy? What conspiracy? Colin asked with great interest. Jason opened his mouth, but he didn't know how to answer this question. Colin seemed a little disappointed and said lightly, Well, Knight Jason, your loot family should be more concerned about how to gain a foothold in Alfalfa City. This unforeseen event is actually a rare opportunity for you. Don't tell me you still don't understand. Opportunity? Jason was stunned. Obviously, he didn't understand Colin's meaning. Colin also didn't explain in detail. He just said in a commanding tone, Since you don't understand, then go back and take a good look. Don't run around all day thinking of unrealistic assistance. Alfalfa City is about to undergo a drastic change. I hope you can properly grasp this opportunity. Jason seemed to realize something and wanted to ask more, but Colin waved his hand and motioned him to leave. Although his heart was full of doubts, Jason didn't dare to go against Colin's will. He had no choice but to bow and take his leave. After Jason left, Colin quickened his pace and caught up with Queen Aisha, who was strolling in front of him. He hugged her waist again. Aisha smiled gently at Colin and asked, Are you the one who stirred up the storm in Alfalfa City? Colin also smiled and didn't deny it, I can't hide anything from you. However, there is one thing I'm curious about. What is it? Do those priceless bonds really exist? Colin laughed and nodded affirmatively, of course they do exist. Moreover, the Earl of Avon of the Eastern region personally instructed the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce to bring them to Alfalfa City. They were prepared to exchange food with him. Aisha blinked her eyes, in that case, the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce is actually under your control? That's right. But there's a problem. Colin nodded as if he already knew what Queen Aisha wanted to say. Do you want to remind me that this will make the Eastern region realize that the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce is a spy under my control? You already thought of it. Yes, and the solution is very simple. What solution? Find a scapegoat. Scapegoat? Queen Aisha repeated the new words that came out of Colin's mouth twice. She seemed to understand the meaning behind it. Is it the Loot family? Smart. Colin gently pecked the Queen's delicate red lips, however, you don't have to worry about the Loot family. I have already arranged for people in Alfalfa City. At least, Ron won't die in revenge. As for whether he has the ability to clean up the mess in Alfalfa City, it will depend on his own ability. As the city lord of Alfalfa City, it is reasonable for Ron to take the blame. Queen Aisha said sternly, you have already helped him a lot. If he holds a grudge against you because of this, then he doesn't know what's good for him. Hold a grudge? No, he will only hug my thigh even tighter. After this, the Lute family will become a thorn in the side of the eastern region. If Ron wants to live, he can only desperately defend Alfalfa City for us. Queen Aisha nodded. Then, she said with some worry, however, I am a little worried. With Ron's ability, he may not be able to control the chaos in Alfalfa City. Actually, it doesn't matter, Colin shrugged and said casually, at least it won't be worse than it is now, right? That's true. As long as it is not controlled by the forces supported by the eastern region, it doesn't matter even if Alfalfa City becomes a mess. At this time, the confident Colin still didn't know that the development of Alfalfa City's situation had deviated from the track he had expected. The affairs of the world were unpredictable. Many times, plans could not keep up with changes. While the two were chatting, the butler came over again and handed a letter to Queen Aisha. The queen hurriedly skimmed through it and handed it to Colin. At the same time, she smiled and said, it's almost time for us to return to Silvermoon City. Colin read the letter and smiled. He reached out and gently stroked Aisha's bulging belly and said, all right. All right, then let us welcome the birth of this new life together. Chapter 369. Yes, the bonds are in my hands. In a dark hut, Orlando faced a group of big shots from Alfalfa City's underground forces and said in a deep voice. At this point, he already knew that no one would believe him no matter how he tried to explain that he had never seen those bonds. Since that was the case, Orlando simply admitted it and was ready to take advantage of it to make a big move. His opening statement immediately made the group of big shots in front of him breathe rapidly. No one could remain calm in the face of such a huge fortune. Orlando's gaze slowly swept across the faces of the crowd. He had a plan in his mind and continued, so, do you want me to give all the bonds to Capone? After a moment of silence, one person stood up and asked, Orlando, what do you want? Orlando smiled indifferently. A trace of madness flashed in his eyes as he encouraged loudly, everyone, why should we work for that kid Capone? How many years has he been in Alfalfa City? And you all know that he's just a dog in the hands of the eastern region. Since these bonds have fallen into Alfalfa City, they are everyone's wealth. But Capone, that old dog, actually wants to take away this wealth to please his master. Can you really bear such a shame? It was unknown whether Orlando was really not good at inciting or if he was facing some old foxes. In short, there was a bit of an awkward silence after his impassioned words. After a moment of awkwardness, someone finally broke the silence, Orlando, don't talk nonsense. As long as you take out those bonds and distribute them to everyone, we will naturally help you deal with Capone. Of course, Orlando couldn't take out the bonds, but at this time, he had no other way out. Therefore, his attitude became particularly tough. He immediately snorted coldly and said, in your dreams. If I take out the bonds and distribute them now, will you still help me? I'm afraid that you'll run away after leaving this door. Then at least give us half first. Don't even think about half. Orlando retorted without hesitation. You want to get benefits without doing anything? Hee, do you really think I'm a fool? Orlando's toughness was instead mistaken for sufficient confidence. However, Orlando was also worried that he would go too far and anger these people in front of him. After all, none of them were kind people. Thus, he immediately added, you don't have to worry that I'll go back on my word. Otherwise, you can also join forces and deal with me like you dealt with Capone. You're much easier to deal with than Capone, a big shot teased. There was a hint of threat and warning in his tone. Of course, Orlando understood what he meant. Although he was worried, he didn't show it on his face. Instead, he deliberately acted impatient and urged. So, everyone, have you made up your minds? Should he continue to be Capone's dog? Or do you want to come with me and chase this outsider out of Alfalfa City? The big shots of Alfalfa City's underground forces looked at each other and finally reached a consensus. Good. Orlando, let's find a new master for Alfalfa City. City Lord's Mansion. Ron quietly listened to the report of his son who had rushed back from the Red Maple Manor, and his heart sank. Sure enough, a smuggled caravan and a batch of priceless bonds couldn't change Count Angeli's mind. Ron restlessly paced back and forth in the room. He had nowhere to vent his anger, and resentment accumulated in his chest, making him seem like a beast facing a desperate situation. Jason looked at his father, who had lost his composure, and hurriedly said, "Father, I thought about it on the way back and suddenly realized that Count Angeli seemed to have known that Alfalfa City would be in chaos." What? Ron stopped and looked at his son with bright eyes. Jason reorganized his words and said, "When I reported to Count Angeli what happened in Alfalfa City at the Red Maple Manor, he didn't have any surprise on his face, as if he already knew. So, I'm guessing that the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce and those priceless bonds were bait thrown out by Count Angeli. He wanted the people of the Alfalfa Brotherhood to fight over them and even kill each other." Ron's eyes lit up. He immediately realized that his son's guess was very likely. In his excitement, he paced back and forth in the room again while muttering, "It's possible. It's really possible. Count Angeli is really good at scheming. As long as the Alfalfa Brotherhood kills each other over those bonds, we'll have a chance to catch our breath and even advance further." Asterisk knock 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 asterisk. At this moment, someone suddenly knocked on the door. "What's the matter?" "Master, there's a mister from the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce outside. He wants to see you." Ron frowned. Then he thought of something and his expression brightened. He hurriedly said, "Let him in." Jason also understood and said, "Father, if our guess is correct, then this Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce is also Count Angeli's chess piece." Ron nodded, but still warned, "Don't say anything later. I'll deal with this person from the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce. After all, we're just guessing. Maybe the other party just came to urge us to find the missing bonds." "Yes, Father." Not long after, a well-dressed middle-aged man led by the steward came to Ron. Looking at this person's face, Ron felt that it was somewhat familiar. However, this person wasn't the steward of the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce who came to report the case a few days ago. After the merchant respectfully saluted, Ron asked, "What's your name?" "Honorable City Lord, my name is Orlando." "Orlando?" Ron frowned. Just as he was about to ask why this name was the same as the famous thief leader in Alfalfa City, he found that the merchant in front of him had already taken off his hat. Then, he took off his beard and the two moles on the left side of his face. "Orlando." Ron put one hand on the sword at his waist and cried out in surprise. Standing in front of him wasn't a merchant from the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce, but the thief leader of Alfalfa City, Orlando. "I'm sorry, City Lord. In order to be able to see you smoothly, I had to put on some disguises," Orlando said courteously. Jason had already drawn his long sword and was pressing it against Orlando's throat. However, Orlando turned a blind eye to it. Ron narrowed his eyes and looked at the other party for a long time before saying to his son, "Jason, don't be rude. This isn't how the Lute family treats guests." Jason withdrew his long sword, but he still looked at Orlando in front of him with vigilance. "Mr. Orlando, how did you deceive my steward?" Ron suddenly asked curiously. Orlando smiled faintly and took out a metal badge from his bosom, saying, "With my ability, stealing an identity card of the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce isn't a difficult thing." "Indeed." Ron nodded in agreement. "After all, the most important thing of that caravan has been stolen by you." However, Orlando slowly shook his head this time and said in a sincere tone, "City Lord, you've wronged me. Stealing an identity card is easy, but stealing the most valuable bond of the caravan, even I can't do it." "Oh. Is that so?" Ron raised his eyebrows, seemingly not believing Orlando's words. "Yes, City Lord. If that bond was really in my hands, do you think I would need to take the risk to see you now? Ron didn't say anything, obviously thinking about the truth of Orlando's words. After a long while, he smiled noncommittally and asked, "Then, Mr. Orlando, why have you come to see me this time?" "City Lord, I'm here to remind you of something." "What is it?" Orlando took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "The Lute family is in imminent danger." Chapter 370. Ha ha ha. After listening to Orlando's warning, Ron laughed until he was out of breath. However, Orlando didn't feel that what he had just said was ridiculous, and he didn't care about Ron's ridicule. He quietly waited for Ron to finish laughing, and then continued without changing his expression, "My lord, if I really wanted to fool you, I wouldn't have chosen such a clumsy reason." Ron restrained his smile and said indifferently, "So, Orlando, why don't you tell me why the Lute family is in danger?" "My lord, have you ever thought about how such a valuable bond could be stolen so easily by my two subordinates?" Ron showed a thoughtful expression. In fact, he had previously guessed that all of this was Count Angeli's scheme based on similar reasons. However, facing Orlando, Ron didn't want to reveal too much of his thoughts, and he just quietly listened to the other side's narration. "My two subordinates didn't reveal the whereabouts of the stolen bonds even though they were tortured beyond recognition." "Ha, I know them. If they really stole those bonds, they would have confessed long ago." "Ha, I know them well. If they really stole those bonds, they would have confessed long ago. Now everyone thinks that the bonds are in my hands, but I can honestly tell you that this is a lie. So, this matter was a trap from beginning to end. Orlando, you should say these words to Capone." "It's useless to say them to me," Ron said indifferently, "and, what does this have to do with the Lute family? What do you mean when you said that the Lute family is in danger?" "My lord, I admit that at this point, it's impossible to wash off the suspicion with just my one-sided words. Everyone believes that the bonds are in my hands. However, have you ever thought about a question? When the caravan first reported the case, they didn't mention the bonds at all. Then why did Capone firmly believe that my subordinates stole the bonds when he found me?" Ron thought for a moment and explained, perhaps the people of the caravan didn't want to attract too much attention at first. If everyone knew that the stolen things were so valuable, they would be even less likely to recover the stolen goods. "No, my lord. You must also know that the caravan belongs to the North Wind Chamber of Commerce. This time, they came to Alfalfa City to hand over the bonds to the East in exchange for an equal amount of food. In that case, the Eastern region would definitely send someone to do the handover. Therefore, the reason why Capone was able to determine the existence of the bonds was because the people in the Eastern region told him so. At this point, Capone trusted the Eastern region, and the Eastern region also trusted the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce. But the problem is, I didn't steal the bonds at all. So, there can only be one truth: Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce lied." Orlando's eyes were burning as he continued, "Then, why would the North Wind Chamber of Commerce, which is obviously colluding with the Eastern region, deliberately lie and let Alfalfa City fall into turmoil? Apparently, the North Wind Chamber of Commerce seems to be in cahoots with the Eastern region, but in fact, they are controlled by Count Angeli." Ron's heart skipped a beat as he secretly approved of Orlando's deduction. Because he himself had just come to a similar conclusion. It was just that he had deduced from the results and motives, while Orlando had deduced from the most important piece of evidence, the bonds. Combining the two, Ron had basically determined that the turmoil in Alfalfa City this time was controlled by Count Angeli behind the scenes. However, in front of Orlando, Ron certainly wouldn't reveal his true feelings, so he just said indifferently, "Mr. Orlando, you've said so much just to prove that those bonds are not in your hands. However, other than yourself, no one will easily believe you." "I understand." Orlando nodded and continued, "But, Sir City Lord, I said so much just to give you a warning." "Warning?" Mr. Orlando, until now, I still don't understand." How did the turmoil in Alfalfa City affect the Lute family? Is that so? Orlando had a playful look in his eyes. Have you ever thought about what will happen if things continue to develop? Ron frowned and fell into deep thought. Orlando continued, there will be a battle between Capone and me, but no matter who wins in the end, this matter needs to end. There will eventually be a conclusion about the existence of the bonds. At that time, the people of the Eastern region will realize that they have been played. The details of the North Wind Chamber of Commerce will be thoroughly seen. So, what does this have to do with the Lute family? Ron still couldn't keep up with Orlando's train of thought. Sir City Lord, the North Wind Chamber of Commerce was willing to do this for Count Angeli. Didn't they think about their own fate? When the people of the Eastern region and the various forces of Alfalfa City realize that they have been played, do you think that Caravan will be able to leave Alfalfa City safely? What are you trying to say? Ron narrowed his eyes and asked in a deep voice. I want to say that the people of the Eastern region and the various forces of Alfalfa City will eventually realize that they have been played, and they will need a target to vent their anger. Since the North Wind Chamber of Commerce dared to do this for Count Angeli, they must know that they have a way to get out, or they know that there will be a scapegoat. So, Sir City Lord, who do you think this scapegoat will be? Ron's face finally changed. Orlando saw this and smiled proudly, saying again, Sir City Lord, you should have thought of it. In fact, I am not surprised that Count Angeli has made such an arrangement. The North Wind Chamber of Commerce is the #1 chamber of commerce in the northern frontier, and they are also an important spy who has successfully gained the trust of the Eastern region. Compared to the Lute family who is struggling in Alfalfa City, their value is much higher. So, when I said that the Lute family is in danger, I was not talking nonsense, right? Impossible. Sir Count Angeli would not do this. Jason shouted with a flustered expression. But Ron's face was gloomy, and he didn't say anything. Why is it impossible? Orlando said lightly, we are small characters, and it is difficult for us to escape the fate of being chess pieces. As chess pieces, we must be aware that we will be sacrificed. The only problem is that we do not have a bargaining chip that the chess player will value. Sir City Lord, forgive me for being blunt, but the bargaining chip in the hands of the North Wind Chamber of Commerce is obviously more important than the Lute family. Nonsense. Jason was still trying to refute Orlando. This matter has nothing to do with our Lute family from beginning to end, so how can it involve us? How can it have nothing to do with you? You are the nominal masters of this city, so you have the motive and the ability to do such a thing. Orlando sneered. As for how to make you scapegoats, there are too many ways. I don't know what Count Angeli's specific plan is, but it is not easy. For example, he can make the priceless bonds coincidentally appear in the City Lord's mansion. No. Jason kept shaking his head, as if what Orlando said would not become reality. But Ron had already agreed with Orlando's judgment in his heart. Their Lute family was indeed very likely to be thrown out as scapegoats. In any case, it was not difficult for Queen Aisha to appoint a new city lord. Moreover, during this period of time, the Lute family's actions were indeed disappointing. Orlando knew that Ron had been persuaded by him, so he quickly opened his mouth again, but, Sir City Lord, chess pieces have their own consciousness, they can struggle, they can resist. This was taught to me by my adopted son, Blue. You may not know, but the reason why I am in such a situation is all thanks to this good son. Of course, I can also understand his actions, because I chose to be a bystander when he needed help the most. His anger, his disappointment, I can completely understand it now. Sir City Lord, Blue is a chess piece against his will, and in the end, he chose to use his own way to take revenge on me. What about you? Are you willing to be pushed out as a scapegoat by Count Angeli? Ron pondered for a long time, and finally raised his head again, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. He stared at Orlando's eyes and asked in a deep voice, then what do you think I should do? Orlando raised his eyebrows, and a relieved expression appeared on his face. Then he said confidently, "Sir City Lord, I have a plan." Chapter 371. As the deadline given by Capone got closer and closer, the atmosphere in Alfalfa City became more and more solemn. What made the people in the city even more frightened was that Orlando did not yield in the face of Capone's ultimatum. Instead, he chose to resist. Perhaps in the eyes of outsiders, Alfalfa City was always in chaos and danger. But in fact, in the eyes of the locals, the chaos here was also orderly. Capone and the Brotherhood of Alfalfa City under his control were leading this kind of order. But now, this order was about to be broken. The various forces in the city began to become restless, both for the priceless bonds and for the authority of the city. Capone's deadline finally arrived under the expectant gazes of many people. On this day, the sun rose as usual. However, there wasn't much human activity in this notorious chaos city. On the empty streets, gusts of wind were sweeping up gusts of wind. In the houses on both sides of the street, pairs of eyes that were mixed with fear and excitement were observing everything outside through the gaps in the windows. Near noon, on several dilapidated main roads of Alfalfa City, in front of the Radiance Church, and in the central plazas of the three districts, groups of figures holding swords and clubs appeared almost simultaneously. As time passed, more and more people gathered. In the afternoon, there were a total of tens of thousands of people gathered at the major traffic points of Alfalfa City. They were divided into two distinct groups, facing each other in silence. No one knew who was the first to make a move, but the two torrents suddenly collided with each other. The members of the Brotherhood of Alfalfa laughed sinisterly as they stabbed the swords in their hands into the chests of their brothers. Between the flashes of the swords, fresh blood slowly spread along the carvings on the bluestone road. It was like a huge and mysterious magic formation, full of a mysterious and tragic aura. At this moment, life was fragile and worthless. Alfalfa City was like a huge mill of flesh and blood, constantly devouring one fresh life after another. The eyes of the two groups of people were bloodshot. They did not have fancy martial arts techniques or high-level fighting auras. They only had the most ferocious momentum and the most primitive brutality. This brutality was completely rooted in the bloodline of the living creatures, the killing instinct and bloodthirsty nature of the inheritors from ancient times. One by one, they were cut down, pierced through, and fell to the ground, twitching and howling. Then, they were trampled under the feet of those who came later. All of their dignity, face, and identity seemed so pale and powerless in the face of slaughter. It didn't matter if they were the leaders of Alfalfa City's reputable gangs, the awe-inspiring gold medal fighters, or even the underlings at the bottom of the chain of contempt. At this moment, everyone had obtained absolute fairness, everyone only had one life. At this time, the fighting taking place in the streets and alleys of Alfalfa City was far from a real confrontation between two armies. There was no neat military formation, no uniform, and no iron-blooded discipline. However, the danger and desperation involved were not inferior in the slightest. These people did not have the organization and cooperation of a regular army, but they were just as ruthless and had the same disregard for life. In terms of tenacity, they were even better. When a small team was scattered by their opponents, they immediately fled in all directions, hiding in the corners of the streets and alleys. When the time was right, they would regroup and attack again. The smell of blood became the strongest smell in the city, and the sound of fighting became the only main sound in this part of the world. The whole city seemed to have become a huge coliseum, crowded with wild beasts killing each other for glory, benefits, and survival. It wasn't until nightfall that the fierce fighting came to an end. The miserable howls and roars gradually subsided. Some people were lying on the ground, and of course, there were also people who stood upright while stepping on the corpses. However, the war had just begun, and it was only the intermission now. Victory and defeat were still far from being decided. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, Orlando looked at Alfalfa City that was gradually being swallowed by darkness with a calm expression. The underling standing behind him was constantly looking up and sizing up his boss's back. He wanted to say something several times, but he hesitated. After a long while, Orlando's cold voice finally came. "Tell them that there is no pension." But, boss, they said that if there is no pension, they will." "I said, there is no pension." Orlando suddenly turned around, his eyes wide open as if he wanted to eat his underling. "Since they have chosen to fight with me against Capone, then don't think about backing down halfway. You go and tell them that when we achieve the final victory, I will give them what they deserve, not a single copper coin less. But now that victory and defeat have not been decided, they can forget about taking anything from me." "Yes." The underling didn't dare to say anything more, and hurriedly retreated. Orlando stared at the dark night sky alone for a while, then turned around and walked downstairs. But just as he turned a corner, he stopped. Because in front of him stood the person he didn't want to see the most, Capone. Orlando only felt his whole body stiffen. He wanted to run away, but he didn't dare to make any movements. Capone stood quietly in the same place, and didn't make any further movements. The ridicule in his eyes was like a fierce tiger observing the struggle before its prey died. Orlando opened his mouth and said bitterly, "There are only 3 people who know that I am here." "Which one betrayed me?" Capone smiled proudly and said, "Guess." At this moment, Orlando still maintained the most basic calmness. After thinking for a moment, he said, "It should be Rice. In today's battle, his subordinates suffered the most casualties, and he is also the one who wants me to take out a portion of the bonds to pay the compensation." Clap clap. Capone actually applauded and praised from the bottom of his heart, "Amazing." "However, Orlando, if you had taken out a portion of the bonds to buy people's hearts earlier, you wouldn't have ended up like this." Orlando pursed his lips and didn't say anything. Capone smiled and continued, "Of course, if you give me all those bonds now, I can still let you live." Orlando still didn't say anything. The smile on Capone's face gradually disappeared, and his tone became cold. Since you don't know what's good for you, then don't blame me for being impolite." Before he finished speaking, Capone was like a strong rhinoceros, charging towards Orlando with an unstoppable momentum. Orlando's face immediately turned pale, and he instinctively rolled forward. Boom! The stone ground exploded with a loud bang, and a large amount of gravel sputtered out like bullets. Many of them hit Orlando's body, smashing bruises. Orlando didn't dare to think too much. He got up from the ground in a sorry state and ran away. As a rank 5 warrior, Capone's personal strength was at the top of the pyramid in Alfalfa City. How could Orlando dare to confront him head-on? However, Capone laughed sinisterly, and a look of ridicule appeared in his eyes. He once again chased after him. Hearing the wind behind him, Orlando didn't have time to think about it. He stabbed with the long sword in his hand. Clang! The long sword was casually slapped by Capone, and the entire blade cracked, shooting out a large amount of fragments. Orlando himself was also sent flying by the huge force transmitted from the longsword, and he crashed into the wall on the side. Orlando spat out a mouthful of blood, and sat paralyzed on the ground, despair appearing in his eyes. Calm and unruffled, Capone slowly approached Orlando and mocked, "Orlando, you still have one last chance. Hand over the bonds, and I'll give you a way out." Orlando gasped a few times, but suddenly laughed. Capone narrowed his eyes in confusion. Just as he was about to ask if the other party was crazy, he suddenly felt a cold gaze coming from behind him. He quickly turned his head and saw a man covered in white armor. He didn't know when he had appeared behind him. Chapter 372. Who are you? Capone asked in a deep voice with a solemn expression. "I am here to kill you." The armored man's way of speaking was a bit strange, as if he hadn't spoken for a long time. It was difficult and slow. But the killing intent contained in his words was so substantial that it couldn't be ignored. Capone felt as if he was facing a formidable enemy. Although the other party hadn't made a move yet and he couldn't figure out his background, Capone knew that the armored man's strength wasn't below his own, just from the fact that he could appear behind him without a sound. When did such a master appear in Alfalfa City? How did I offend your excellency to make you want to kill me? Capone asked tentatively. At the same time, he saw Orlando, who had fallen into despair, with a gloating smile on his face. This smile made Capone's heart thump. He realized that he had been fooled. Orlando was the bait. The armored man didn't answer Capone's question, perhaps because he was too lazy to explain. He slowly pulled out the long sword at his waist, and the sonorous sound of unsheathing broke the last trace of hope in Capone's heart. Chi! The long sword swung out. In an instant, countless images poured into Capone's mind. He seemed to see magma flowing, volcanoes erupting, and cliffs breaking and falling. Huge rocks crashed to the ground, and flames and meteors burst out in all directions. Ah! Capone roared and suddenly broke free from the illusion. When he opened his eyes again, he was shocked to find that the tip of the armored man's sword was about to touch his forehead. Boom! At the critical moment, Capone only had time to raise his sword and swing it up. A huge explosion shook the ground, and the broadsword in Capone's hand shattered inch by inch like glass. Countless fragments fell to the ground, making a sizzling sound. There was also a wisp of smoke, as if it had just been thrown into a hot furnace to forge. The terrifying impact knocked Capone away, and he knelt on the ground. The armored man slowly approached, his cold eyes filled with a bone-chilling murderous intent. "It's over," Orlando said gloatingly, a trace of relief flashing in his eyes. But at this moment, Capone's lowered head suddenly raised. His arms were crossed in front of him in an instant, and he roared, "I want you to die." Clang! Clang! As Capone waved his hands, streaks of cold black light streaked across his body like scissors. The two figures crossed each other and retreated once again. The armored man didn't seem to realize that Capone's attack had suddenly become so strange. Two deep cracks immediately appeared on his chest armor. Capone stood in front of the armored man, bent his knees and bent his waist. Two daggers glowing with a faint blue light appeared in his hands. A sinister and crazy smile appeared on his face. He roared in a strange tone, "Don't worry. Brat, I'm going to rip open your chest, cut open your skull, peel off your skin, and bring all your organs back for my collection." The armored man stared at Capone and spoke again in a stiff tone, "You are also grade 6. Capone smiled smugly and said, "That's right. I've been hiding my strength for many years. I didn't expect that it was actually forced out by you. Kid, who the hell are you?" As a 6th Order warrior, it's impossible for him to be nameless. Indeed, although a 6th Order warrior wasn't as rare as a sanctuary-level warrior, he was definitely a big shot. In the entire Radiance Empire, there were only a handful of them. The armored man still didn't reveal his identity. He just looked at Capone with indifferent eyes, as if the other party's hidden strength didn't worry him too much. It was just that this indifference was seen by Capone as a disregard for himself, which also deeply hurt his proud heart. "Hiding your head but showing your tail, go to hell." Capone didn't hesitate to activate his strongest state. A faint blue light suddenly burst out from his hands, spreading upward like flowing water, and condensing into a strange symbol in the middle of his chest. In an instant, his speed suddenly increased by a large margin. Chi! His whole body suddenly turned into a blue shadow and rushed toward the armored man. The armored man didn't dodge, and his posture was still indifferent. He just held his sword with both hands and raised it high. Whoosh! The long sword suddenly twisted, drawing a semicircular arc in the air. In the blink of an eye, countless thin lines condensed from fighting energy fell from the sky like dense arrows, madly shooting toward Capone's position. Capone's eyes narrowed, but he didn't dodge at all. His eyes lit up with a dazzling blue light, and in an instant, it was as if everything in the world had stopped at the same time. Boom! The two men collided without any fancy moves, and a circle of invisible ripples suddenly burst out, like ripples spreading in all directions. Orlando looked at the two men in the battle with a horrified expression, completely dispelling the original idea of going up to help. He could only keep retreating, for fear of being affected by the aftermath of the battle. Clang! Clang! The two men were evenly matched, and in an instant, they exchanged countless blows. After separating again, Capone suddenly laughed and said, "Lucien of the northern frontier, so it's you." Obviously, after this exchange, Capone recognized the armored man's true identity. However, the armored man didn't have any reaction to this, neither admitting nor denying it. On the side, Orlando's heart trembled slightly. Of course, he had heard of Lucien's name. He knew that this level 6 warrior of the northern frontier had married Countess Schultz, and that countless warriors were envious of him. However, a month ago, he was suddenly exposed for plotting to kill Bishop John of Swan City. Since then, his reputation had been tarnished, and even Countess Schultz had drawn a clear line with him. He didn't expect that he would actually appear in Alfalfa City, and, just as Orlando's imagination was running wild, Lucien and Capone were once again entangled in battle. Perhaps it was because his identity had been exposed, Lucien's attacks became fiercer and fiercer. He even had a crazy momentum of fighting with his life. Poochie! Capone grabbed the long sword that pierced his right shoulder, and with a grim smile, he stabbed a dagger into Lucien's left chest. At the same time, he licked his lips, his eyes cold and manic as he growled, "You want to fight with your life on the line? Ha ha ha. I've experienced countless battles in my life, and the last thing I'm afraid of is fighting with my life on the line." Lucien didn't say a word, nor did he take half a step back. His right hand sank, and the long sword slashed down along Capone's shoulder. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of bones breaking could be heard. Capone didn't budge an inch, and the madness on his face became more intense. The dagger in his hand twisted rapidly, stirring up Lucien's chest like an electric drill. The two peak warriors were no different from desperate beasts that had met on a narrow path. All skills, strategies, and glory were thrown to the back of their minds. There was only one last thought left, to kill each other. The gurgling blood kept dripping, blooming into a demonic flower of blood on the devastated ground. A tragic aura circulated in the air, as if the Grim Reaper had quietly arrived, quietly waiting for the moment to wave his scythe. Capone stared at the armored man's eyes, trying to find a trace of hesitation and retreat in them. A warrior like him, who had climbed up step by step from the bottom, had long been accustomed to this feeling of wandering on the edge of life and death. He also knew very well that in this process of constantly falling into the bottomless abyss, whoever retreated first would lose. Capone had gambled with his opponent countless times, and every time, he was the winner. Therefore, this time, he still firmly believed that he would win. Gradually, Capone's body began to shake, and the excessive blood loss made his brain start to lack oxygen. In a trance, he seemed to smell the breath of death. But Capone still didn't retreat. He knew that as long as he could hold on for a while, his opponent would definitely collapse. It had always been like this in the past. This time, it would be no exception. However, as time went by, Capone's confidence was rapidly fading. This was because he was shocked to find that the armored man opposite him was even more determined than him. Moreover, the armored man's strength didn't weaken in the slightest, and his body didn't tremble at all. It was as if what he had stabbed into the armored man's chest wasn't a fatal dagger, but a negligible needle. However, at this moment, even if Capone wanted to retreat, it was impossible. There was no turning back in the process of falling into the cliff of death. The Grim Reaper waiting at the bottom of the valley must harvest a soul. You. Why? Aren't you afraid? Capone asked weakly. The armored man opposite him didn't answer, but the ridicule in his eyes was so strong that it was about to overflow. Bang! Finally, Capone was completely exhausted and knelt in front of the armored man. Chapter 373. Honorable Master Lucien, thank you for your help. Orlando carefully stepped forward and respectfully saluted the armored man. Although his heart was also filled with doubts, such as how did Lucien become Count Angeli's subordinate? And why did this person still have a calm and indifferent look on his face even though there was a big bloody hole in his chest? However, one thing was very clear, his life was saved by the person in front of him. Moreover, Orlando, who had been forced to a dead end, had once again seen the hope of survival. Perhaps, it could even go one step further. Colin looked at Orlando through the eyes of the blood slave Lucien, and his heart was filled with emotions. The chaos in Alfalfa City this time was indeed planned by Colin, but the development of the matter was beyond his expectations. It had to be said that the subjective initiative of a person was a wonderful thing. Every individual in the midst of chaos was struggling for their own interests, their own hatred, and their own fate. Harry, Blue, Ron, Capone, Orlando, in Colin's eyes, these people were originally small characters, chess pieces, but they might not be willing to follow the path that Colin had planned for them. These were the variables. This was also the reason why the more complicated the conspiracy, the harder it was to succeed. A simple and crude method would rarely lead to unplanned situations. However, to be simple and crude, one must have the strength to break through the situation. This, at least in Alfalfa City, was something that Colin could not do at the moment. Therefore, he had planned all of this. Although there were many accidents, fortunately, the final result was still satisfactory. Moreover, Colin had also received a pleasant surprise, Orlando. This thief leader of Alfalfa City might be of low birth, or perhaps he had an unbearable past, or perhaps even his character was questionable, but this time, he really made Colin have a whole new level of respect for him. Calmness in the face of a desperate situation, the wisdom to see through the puzzle, the courage to survive in the face of death, the courage to use himself as bait. If they were in each other's shoes, Colin knew that he might not be able to do better than him. This was a talent. If used properly, it might be able to help Colin secretly control Alfalfa City and even cause great trouble for the eastern region. It was a pity that Orlando was not a knight. Otherwise, Colin would have turned him into a blood descendant. It would be too much of a waste to turn them into blood thralls, Sir Lucien. Orlando looked at the silent armored man and could not help but feel a little uneasy. He reminded him, "Your injury, it's just a minor injury. It's fine." Under Colin's control, Lucien waved his hands casually and touched the broken armor to cover the unsightly wound. Orlando's lips twitched, but he did not dare to say anything. He changed the topic and said, "Master Lucien, may I pay a visit to Count Angeli and express my gratitude in person?" "The Count can't see you yet." Colin flatly refused. Seeing the disappointment on Orlando's face, he continued, "However, the Earl knows about you and is very satisfied with you." Orlando regained his hope and hurriedly said, "Thank you for your recognition, Count. Please tell the Earl that I am willing to swear allegiance to him. No matter what the Earl orders, I will do my best to accomplish it. I will convey your sincerity to the Earl, but under the current circumstances, you cannot be exposed." Orlando rolled his eyes and seemed to understand something. He immediately nodded and said, "Yes. What does the Earl have in mind for me?" The armored man's deep eyes showed no joy or anger, and his tone was very stiff. "The Earl said that since you can guess his plan and break free from this puzzle, it means that you are a smart person. Therefore, the Earl is willing to give you a chance to prove yourself. Without Capone, the Alfalfa Brotherhood will need a new leader, and you have great hope for that position right now. In a while, you will go to 87 Farron Street, where the Earl has left you a gift. At the same time, this is the greatest help the Earl can give you. As for whether you can control the underground forces of Alfalfa City, it will depend on your own ability. Thank you for your trust, Count. I will not let him down," Orlando said loudly. He had already vaguely guessed what the gift Count Angeli had left for him was. Moreover, he also knew that it could be a gift, but it could also be a rope that would take his life. However, Orlando did not hesitate to accept this gift. This near-death experience made him understand a lot of things. A small character like him, who had no influence or strength, might have a smart brain, but it was impossible to survive in such a chaotic world with just this. He had to have someone to rely on. Moreover, Orlando was also very clear that he did not have the right to refuse. Count Angeli had sent people to save him, but he could also send people to destroy him. Therefore, Orlando had to follow the script that Count Angeli had set for him and give the drama of Alfalfa City a perfect ending. Orlando raised his head and asked again, "Lord Lucian, I wonder if the Count has a detailed plan?" The armored man shook his head and said, "No, the rest is up to you." "Yes." Orlando was a little worried, but more than that, he was eager to give it a try. The armored man saw the ambition of this small person, but he did not say anything more. Instead, he turned around and carried Capone, who had fainted on the ground and was on the verge of death, and disappeared into the dark night in a few flashes. Orlando stared at the place where the armored man had disappeared for a long time, then turned around and went downstairs. A group of loyal subordinates had already gathered downstairs, and after seeing Orlando, they immediately surrounded him. They had received orders before that no matter what happened upstairs, they were not allowed to come up, so after hearing the sounds of fighting, they were burning with anxiety. It was not until now that they saw Orlando appear again safe and sound that they finally felt relieved. "Boss, we found out that it was Musos who leaked your whereabouts to Capone." Orlando nodded, as if he was not surprised by this news, and did not give any orders, as if this guy who leaked the secret was not worth his attention. The subordinates looked at each other as they watched Orlando walk out without saying a word, and they had no choice but to quickly follow him. Under the cover of the night, Orlando successfully arrived at the address that the armored man had told him, and then found the gift that Earl Angeli had left for him in the abandoned warehouse. Yes, it was the priceless bond. Looking at this thing that had turned Alfalfa City upside down, Orlando could not help but sigh. But soon, he put away these meaningless emotions, hid the bond close to his body, and walked out. Outside the warehouse, the subordinates kept reporting that the leaders of the major forces in Alfalfa City wanted to see Orlando. But Orlando snorted coldly and did not agree. Instead, he asked, "Did you find out the details of the messenger of the Eastern region that I asked you to investigate?" "Yes, the one who came to see Capone this time is Viscount Fine of the Eastern region." "Where is he now?" "In the cathedral in the Eastern City District." Orlando nodded, took a deep breath, touched the place where the bond was hidden at his waist, and said, "Well, let's go see this Viscounts of the Eastern region." Chapter 374. Sunday. If it were in other cities, this would be the day of worship. However, in Alfalfa City, a city without faith, the Church of Holy Light located in the Eastern District was particularly deserted. This dilapidated cathedral had been through hundreds of years of wind and rain, and had been abandoned several times. The priests did not get the respect they deserved in this city, and they would even be treated as fat sheep to be slaughtered by the villains here. Over time, they were unwilling to come. However, recently, a young bishop from the Eastern region had come here, trying to bring the grace of the God of Light to this city, which was known as the most depraved city in the entire continent. Of course, this bishop did not really have the courage to sacrifice himself to feed the tiger, but because the city had gradually been controlled by the Alfalfa Brotherhood, it was also controlled by the Eastern region in disguise. If he came here to preach, he would not be threatened. However, it seemed that it would still take a certain amount of time to make all the villains in this city become devout believers of the God of Light. In the empty prayer hall, only a single-digit number of people were worshipping. The young man in gorgeous clothes was the Viscount Fine, who had been sent by the Eastern region to Alfalfa City to secretly hand over the bonds with the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce. This person was handsome and had an extraordinary temperament. There was an unconcealable arrogance between his eyebrows. This was also a common characteristic of every young person who was in a high position. After the service, the Viscount's fine chatted with the bishop for a while, and then left the prayer hall. Passing through the corridor alone, the Viscount's fine came to the garden behind the church. "I'm sorry, Mr. Arnold. I've kept you waiting." "Lord Viscounts, you're too polite. I came at a bad time and disturbed your service." The president of the Northern Wind Chamber of Commerce respectfully welcomed the Viscount's fine into the pavilion and personally poured him a cup of coffee. The Viscount's fine sat down at the table, took a sip of coffee, and then said straightforwardly, "Mr. Arnold, I'm very disappointed in this matter." Arnold suddenly said with a bitter face, "Lord Viscounts, you really can't blame me for this. Wasn't it stolen by the Alfalfa Brotherhood? When the Earl of Avon chose Alfalfa City as the trading location, he promised that my caravan would never encounter any danger here, but... Mr. Arnold, you clearly arrived earlier than the agreed time. We aren't ready yet." Viscount's Fines interrupted with an awkward look on his face. "Lord Viscounts, I was worried that something might happen along the way, so I deliberately set off early." Who would have thought that something like this would happen in Alfalfa City? Viscount's Fines opened his mouth, but he could not say anything more. He knew that strictly speaking, this matter was indeed the Eastern region's problem, but the members of the Alfalfa Brotherhood were simply too difficult to control. "Mr. Arnold, you shouldn't have let two little thieves steal such an important item, right? Are the guards of your caravan just for show?" Viscount's Fines questioned again. He was still unwilling to bear the responsibility for the theft of the bonds alone. Arnold shook his head and said, "Lord Viscounts, you may not know this, but there were more than 2 thieves who visited our caravan that night." "Oh? Who else?" Arnold's eyes flashed, and he said seriously, "I don't know the true identity of the other party, but there was indeed a group of powerful experts who sneaked into our caravan that night. At that time, the caravan's guards were all dealing with these people, so the 2 thieves took advantage of the loophole." Viscount's Fines frowned. Obviously, he did not expect there to be such a hidden story. Seeing this, Arnold suggested again, "Lord Viscounts, you can ask Lord Capone. After all, he has a deeper control of the underground forces of Alfalfa City. Perhaps he knows what happened that night." Capone. Viscount's Fines frowned even more because there had been no news of Capone since he left alone last night. He did not know where the other party was or what he was doing. At this moment, a thought suddenly appeared in Viscount's Fines' mind. Could it be that Capone had sent people on the night of the bond theft? Could it be that he had been fooled? Arnold saw that Viscount's Fines was silent and his expression kept changing. He knew that his hint had successfully affected the other party, so he did not say anything else. A lie did not have to be complete and detailed. Sometimes, it was easier to let the other party's imagination fill in the truth. After a long time, Viscount's Fines said, "Mr. Arnold, you don't have to worry about the bond. I'll help you get it back. You can go back and wait for the news." "Yes." After Arnold left, Viscount's Fines felt that there was something wrong with Capone, so he found an attendant to ask for news of Capone. However, to his disappointment, there was still no news of Capone. At this time, Viscount's Fines could not help but let his imagination run wild. Could it be that Capone had run away with the money? Not long after, the attendant came to report again, "Sir, Mr. Orlando is outside asking for an audience." "Orlando?" Viscount's Fines frowned, then nodded and said, "Bring him to see me." Soon, Orlando walked into the church alone under the lead of the attendant and saw Viscount's Fines. As soon as he saw Orlando, Viscount's Fines snorted coldly and said angrily, "Orlando, you actually dare to come to see me?" Orlando bowed unhurriedly and then said, "Viscounts, I know that you may have some misunderstandings about me, but there are some important things that I have to hand over to you personally." Viscount's Fines raised his eyebrows and asked, "What important things?" Orlando immediately took a few steps forward and took out the bonds hidden in his clothes, placing them in front of Viscount's Fines. Viscount Fine's expression changed, and he hurriedly went forward to check. After confirming the authenticity and number of the bonds, he asked in a deep voice, "Orlando, since these bonds are really in your hands, why didn't you take the initiative to hand them over?" "Viscounts, because I know the importance of these things, I don't want them to fall into the hands of people with evil intentions." "What do you mean?" Orlando took a deep breath and said with a pained expression, "Sir, don't you understand? All of this is a show directed and acted by Capone. He just wants to take all of these bonds for himself." "What?" Viscount Fiennes cried out in shock. Arnold's report just now had already made Viscount Fiennes begin to suspect Capone, and now Orlando was added. Viscount Fiennes' mind raced, but he still asked in a deep voice, "Do you have any evidence for what you said?" Orlando nodded and said confidently, "Sir, in the beginning, my subordinates didn't know about the existence of these bonds at all. Not only them, but even I didn't know about it. Back then, my subordinates went to the caravan to make a small fortune. Who knew that they would bump into a group of people fighting with the caravan guards? In the chaos, they accidentally stole the bonds. However, the two of them didn't have much knowledge and didn't know what it was, so they handed it to me. I knew that this matter was of great importance, so I didn't explain it to them. Therefore, when Capone interrogated them with torture, they didn't know that what they had taken was what Capone wanted. It wasn't until Blue couldn't bear the punishment and randomly accused me that Capone suspected that the bonds were in my hands. Of course, I wouldn't give the bonds to Capone." Viscount Fiennes didn't know much about the specific situation of the interrogation, so he didn't doubt Orlando's story. It wasn't until he heard the end that he asked, "Why didn't you give the bonds to Capone?" "Because I suspected that the group of people who sneaked into the caravan were Capone's subordinates. Before you came, Capone restrained the people of the Alfalfa Brotherhood and warned us not to attack the passing caravan. That's why we didn't dare to attack the North Wind Chamber of Commerce. Harry and Blue only dared to steal. And other than himself, who else would dare to ignore Capone's warning at this time?" Viscount Fiennes' eyes flashed slightly, but he didn't say anything. Seeing this, Orlando continued to explain, "Sir, last night, Capone came to me again and said that as long as I handed over the bonds, he could share them with me. Are you sure?" Viscount Fiennes' eyes widened as he asked. "Of course." Orlando straightened his chest and said without fear, "If you don't believe me, you can find Capone. I dare to confront him face to face." Viscount Fiennes narrowed his eyes and carefully sized up Orlando. The other party looked back without fear, his gaze honest. Such a posture greatly reduced Viscount Fiennes' suspicion of Orlando. He was silent for a moment before he asked again, "What happened last night?" "When I heard Capone say that, I immediately confirmed my previous suspicions, so I wouldn't hand over the bonds to him. I pretended to say that I was going to get the bonds, but in fact, I took the opportunity to escape. After daybreak, I took the initiative to look for you. I hope that you can uphold justice for me." Viscount Fiennes pondered for a long time before he said to Orlando, "All right, I will verify what you said. However, since you took the initiative to hand over these bonds, I will definitely report this credit to the Earl of Avon." "Thank you, Lord Viscounts." Orlando bowed and said. He wasn't afraid that Viscount Fiennes would verify it because Capone had already disappeared. This was enough to prove that the other party was guilty. And after Capone disappeared, there would definitely be someone to fill his vacancy. As for this candidate, Orlando lowered his head respectfully and revealed a smug smile. Chapter 375. Silvermoon City. In the basement of Half-Elven Palace, Colin looked at Capone kneeling in front of him, his eyes flashing with satisfaction. As a result, his blood shadow guards now had a second 6th-rank blood slave, which was something worth celebrating. To be honest, he did have the idea of fighting Capone back then, otherwise he wouldn't have sent blood slave Lucien out of Alfalfa City to get a 5th-rank blood slave. But he didn't expect that Capone was actually hiding his strength. Unfortunately, due to his overconfidence, Capone had stepped into the trap that Orlando had set for him alone. Furthermore, he had chosen the stupidest way to deal with Lucien. Otherwise, Lucien would not have been able to defeat Capone alone, but he was not confident that he would be able to defeat Capone. Colin stared at Capone for a long time and suddenly felt that this person might be an important chess piece that the Eastern region had placed in Alfalfa City. After all, a 6th-rank warrior wasn't a cabbage. Even the Duke of St. Prospero couldn't underestimate such a person. After all, the Eastern region didn't have any sanctuary experts. 6th rank was the peak. It seemed that Alfalfa City really played an extremely important role in the Eastern region's plan. Otherwise, Capone wouldn't have hidden his strength and wronged himself in such a place. Thinking of this, Colin suddenly felt that Orlando might not be able to easily deceive the Eastern region and replace Capone as the leader of Alfalfa City's underground forces. However, he didn't care about this now. Alfalfa City wasn't a strategic point in Colin's plan. Even if the Eastern region regained control, it wouldn't have a big impact. He was actually able to get a 6th-rank blood slave this time, which was already a big gain. As for Orlando, it would depend on his own luck. If he could smoothly pass, it would naturally be a surprise for Colin. If not, then he could only blame himself for his bad luck. In such a hierarchical world, it was extremely difficult for a commoner to become a fish that leaped over the dragon's gate. Colin wouldn't easily change his strategy or waste his resources for such a thief leader. In short, Orlando could only rely on himself. Colin hoped that he would be able to see another surprise in the near future. While he was thinking, Capone had already put on a full set of armor under Colin's instructions, covering himself tightly. Bang bang. Colin reached out and patted Capone's helmet twice as he revealed a smug smile. Now that he had 2 blood thralls of the 6th step, Colin felt that he could officially consider hunting a knight of the 6th step. Of course, before that, Colin had to stabilize the half-elf kingdom. After settling Capone down, Colin left the basement. The basement led directly to the Queen's study. However, considering that Aisha was about to give birth, Colin did not allow her to work anymore and sent her to rest. Only Colin's half-elf maid, Kathy Savoy, was in the study. On this trip to Silver Moon City, Colin had brought Kathy along. It was an opportunity for her to go home and take a look. However, this half-elf maid did not return to the Savoy family's manor even once after arriving at Silver Moon City, as if she had completely cut off all ties with them. Seeing Colin walk up from the basement, Kathy hurriedly poured him a cup of coffee and reported at the same time, "Master, Duke Modwin came to look for you just now. Seeing that you were not around, he left behind a handwritten letter." Colin nodded, indicating that he understood. Although Queen Aisha had already returned to Silver Moon City, she was about to give birth. Many of the affairs of the half-elf kingdom were still handled by Duke Modwin. However, Duke Modwin would report to Colin every day. Obviously, he was very clear about who held the authority of the half-elf kingdom. Colin sat down in front of the desk, drinking coffee as he flipped through the handwritten letter that Duke Modwin had left behind. It listed the affairs of the kingdom that had been handled by Duke Modwin. At the same time, he reminded Colin once again that there was a large group of rebels gathered in Silver Moon City, and they were plotting something. Seeing this, Colin could not help but smile mysteriously. Duke Modwin had reminded him many times about this rebel force. He had even suggested that they should be arrested before they took action, so as to not disturb the Queen's delivery. However, Colin had never agreed to it. Instead, he had asked him to be patient and wait patiently. This time, Colin had indulged these rebel forces so that all the half-elves who were dissatisfied with Queen Aisha would take the initiative to jump out. This way, Colin would be able to capture them all in one fell swoop, so as to prevent any more trouble in the future. Moreover, with the blood cavalry in the city, Colin was not worried that the situation would be out of his control. Even if the Silvermoon Guard were to rebel, Colin was confident that he could forcefully suppress them. What he was worried about now was whether there would be anyone who had designs on the Queen and the child that was about to be born. For this reason, Colin had already replaced all the guards in Queen Aisha's chamber with the Blood Shadow Guards. With the current combat power of the Blood Shadow Guards, unless a powerhouse of the Sanctuary Realm appeared or an army of tens of thousands charged into the half-elven palace, no one would be able to get close to Queen Aisha. The only thing he had to be wary of were the doctors and maids who were attending to Queen Aisha's delivery. However, these doctors and maids were personally selected by Aisha, so there should be no problem in terms of loyalty. At the thought of this, Colin put down the letter, and was about to leave the study when he saw Kathy still standing there with her hands behind her back. She looked like she wanted to say something, but was hesitating. "Kathy, is there anything else?" "Master, there's something I need to report to you." "Speak." Kathy carefully lifted her head to look at Colin, and said softly, "Master, Baron Savoy sent someone to contact me yesterday." Colin knew that the Baron Kathy was talking about should be her cousin. Back when Kathy had helped Colin lure the Sky Horse army to attack Silvermoon City, Colin had promised to give the Savoy family the title of Baron after the deed was done. However, Kathy herself would rather be Colin's maid than become a Baron of the Half-Elven Kingdom. Hence, the title of Baron fell to her cousin. "Why did he look for you?" Colin asked with a smile, as if he had realized something. Kathy hesitated for a moment, but still said honestly, "He was asking me about the doctor who attended to Her Majesty's delivery." Colin's eyes narrowed. Seeing this, Kathy hurriedly explained, "Master, don't worry. I didn't tell him anything." Colin nodded with satisfaction, "You did well. However, I suggest that you make a trip back to the Savoy family. If Baron Savoy asks again, tell him the identity of the doctor who attended to the delivery." But... Kathy was dumbfounded, and stuttered, not knowing what to do. Colin smiled as he walked to Kathy, patted her shoulder, and said gently, "Just do what you need to do. Don't worry, just do it. I've already arranged everything. Actually, I'm also very curious. What kind of tricks are those people up to?" "Yes, Master." Kathy nodded, but her eyes couldn't help but reveal a tinge of sadness. Colin understood that Kathy was worried about her family, so he comforted her, "You've been with me for so long, you should know that I'm not a bloodthirsty person. Hence, the Savoy family won't be cut off. On the contrary, after getting rid of the rotten branches, your family will be able to develop even better." "Master, I understand." Kathy was relieved. She nodded and left. Colin looked at her retreating figure and smiled as he muttered to himself, "I've given you a chance. I've given you a chance, but don't let me down." Chapter 376. A carriage with simple decorations slowly drove into Silvermoon City's business district, stopping in front of a luxurious house. The door of the car opened, and a tall young man walked out. He was wearing a wide triangular hat, and his head was lowered. His face couldn't be seen clearly, but from the small details of his posture, one could tell that he was a noble with an extraordinary background. "I'm sorry, sir. May I have a look at your invitation?" The attendant politely stopped the young man. But before the young man could show his invitation, a short, fat, and slightly bald middle-aged man in a floral robe rushed out with vigorous steps. He pushed the attendant aside, and welcomed the young man in with a fawning expression. The attendant who had been pushed aside stared at the scene with his mouth agape, unable to come back to his senses for a long time. Of course, he didn't dare get angry, because the middle-aged man who had rushed out was the legendary half-elf merchant of Silvermoon City, Javier. So, the attendant was just a little surprised. Who was the young man that Javier had to welcome him personally, and with such a humble attitude? After entering the house, the young man took off his hat, revealing a resolute, handsome, yet somewhat cold face. If Colin were here, he would definitely recognize the young man as his old acquaintance, Marquis Vincent. The eldest son of the Duke of the Eastern Region had returned to Silvermoon City after more than half a year. Marquis Vincent's brows were tightly furrowed, perhaps because he'd recalled some unpleasant memories from the last time he'd been here. Javier smiled along the way, saying some witty words, but Marquis Vincent's expression didn't turn for the better, which made him even more anxious. As the central building of Silvermoon City's business district, the decorations here could be said to be extremely luxurious. At a glance, all one could see was magnificent gold paint. Even the cracks in the white glaze on the ground were covered with melted gold. Unfortunately, this style of nouveau riche obviously couldn't enter Marquis Vincent's eyes. Not only was he unable to look at it, he couldn't smell it either. The moment Marquis Vincent entered, he couldn't help but cover his nose. The fragrance here was too strong, so strong that it choked his nose. Of course, Marquis Vincent could understand why. Half-elf female slaves in light gauze dresses were displaying their beautiful naked bodies in front of the guests. If the guests were interested, they could discuss with them the pleasure that wasn't for the sake of reproduction. Although Marquis Vincent didn't like these lowly female slaves, not everyone was so reserved. The smell of perfume in the room couldn't completely cover the stench of pheromones. Javier was smart enough to notice Marquis Vincent's discomfort. He quickly asked the maid to open all the windows for some fresh air. Lord Marquis, this time I have gathered the leaders of the 17 most influential half-elf merchant guilds in Silvermoon City to listen to your teachings. Marquis Vincent finally showed a satisfied expression. He nodded and followed Javier into the conference hall. The hall was very spacious. The round table made of gold-plated oak was very eye-catching. The conference chairs made of white-striped tiger hide were also very exquisite, but the overall style was less serious. Seeing Marquis Vincent walk in, the merchants sitting around the table stood up and bowed to greet him. Marquis Vincent raised his hand and gestured for everyone to sit down. Javier brought Marquis Vincent to the main seat and said in a clear voice, "Everyone, today we have the honor of inviting the first successor of the House of Saint Prospero, Marquis Vincent. I'm sure everyone knows why this conference is being held. We, the Half-Elf Merchant Guild, cannot be trampled on by others. We must fight for our own interests. Fortunately, we are not fighting alone. Marquis Vincent has brought the support of the Duke of the Eastern region to our Half-Elf Merchant Guild. Please believe that as long as we work together, we will definitely be able to make our voices heard." Javier was very good at livening up the atmosphere. He also understood that although the merchants were rich, they lacked status. They wanted to be respected more than anyone else. Next, let's invite the Honorable Marquis Vincent to speak for us. After he finished speaking, Javier sat down on the first seat on the left. The meeting room was immediately filled with warm applause and praises. Vincent smiled reservedly. As the Honorable Marquis of the Eastern region, he actually looked down on these lowly, vulgar, and mercenary merchants from the bottom of his heart. If it weren't for his own plan, he wouldn't sit at the same table with these people. Marquis Vincent looked around and said, "I don't want to waste time talking nonsense, so I'll get straight to the point." After a short pause, Marquis Vincent picked up the silver teacup and took a sip. The fragrance of the tea lingered in his mouth and calmed him down a bit. He continued, "The reason why you are gathered here is that you don't want the food you worked so hard to accumulate to be bought by Count Angeli in the northern frontier at a low price. However, facing the power of the northern frontier and the favoritism of Queen Aisha, you don't dare to openly resist. However, you don't have to worry. The Half-Elf Kingdom isn't a territory of the northern frontier. It's also not a garden that Queen Aisha can play with as she pleases." Hearing this, the half-elf merchants sitting around the table became spirited and looked at Marquis Vincent with expectant eyes. "I can tell you clearly that Silvermoon City is about to experience a huge change. From now on, this place is no longer a place where Queen Aisha or Count Angeli can do whatever they want. In that case, everyone, I wonder if you're willing to contribute to this." After hearing this, the half-elf merchants all expressed their willingness to cooperate with Marquis Vincent. They already knew that Queen Aisha was a puppet supported by Count Angeli. Even the child in her belly was most likely Count Angeli's. A queen like this would never be able to protect the interests of the half-elf kingdom, and it would be impossible for her to gain the support of these half-elf merchants. Marquis Vincent nodded with satisfaction and said, "Good. Since everyone is so enthusiastic, I'm relieved. I've already arranged for people to do the scheming and fighting. As for everyone, I only hope that you can do one thing within the scope of your abilities. Lord Marquis, if you need us to do anything, please tell us directly." Havel immediately stood up and spoke on behalf of the half-elf merchants. Marquis Vincent also stood up from his seat. His gloomy eyes slowly swept over the half-elf merchants, then he said in a serious tone, "I want you to burn all the grain stores." "What?" After hearing this, the half-elf merchants' faces all changed. They never thought that the Marquis of the Eastern region would actually want them to do such a thing. "What? You don't want to do it?" Marquis Vincent coldly asked. Facing this kind of question, the half-elf merchants all lowered their heads and didn't dare to speak. But after a moment of silence, a half-elf merchant finally stood up and said, "Lord Marquis, what you're doing is even more excessive than Count Angeli. Although his price is low, at least we won't suffer a loss. But what you're doing will cause us to suffer a huge loss. Rather than that, we might as well cooperate with Count Angeli." Marquis Vincent chuckled and said, "You know what? This is the first objection I've received since coming to Silvermoon City." The half-elf merchant straightened his neck and said firmly, "Lord Marquis, if you still don't care about the interests of your allies, you'll only receive more objections in the future." "Are you lecturing me?" "I wouldn't dare. I'm just advising you." "Advising?" Marquis Vincent stood up calmly and slowly walked behind the half-elf merchant. He put his hands on his shoulders and said with a smile, "But you know what? Only my father, the Duke of the Eastern region, has the qualifications to talk to me in such a tone." The half-elf merchant wanted to continue arguing, but he saw the shock and disbelief in the eyes of others. Before he could figure out what was going on, Marquis Vincent, who was behind him, picked up the table knife that was used to eat desserts on the table with a sinister smile, grabbed his hair, and viciously stabbed it into his eyes. The table knife, which wasn't considered sharp, was pushed by the huge force and stabbed into the half-elf merchant's eyeball without any resistance. It went deep into his brain. Blood and brain matter splattered on the white tablecloth, like blooming flowers. The blood-curdling screams that sounded like pigs being slaughtered echoed, but they became weaker and weaker. Finally, it returned to a deathly silence. Marquis Vincent acted like he had done something insignificant. He calmly took out a white silk handkerchief, wiped the blood on his hands, and casually covered the corpse in front of him. After doing all this, a satisfied smile appeared on his face, as if the violence that had accumulated since entering Silvermoon City had finally been vented. Now, who else objects? Chapter 377. The air in the conference hall seemed to have frozen. No one dared to make a sound, and they even tried their best to control their breathing. The thick smell of blood gradually filled the air, and the half-elf merchants finally realized one thing: nobles would kill. No matter how gentle and kind they were, from the beginning to the end, the nobles' rule was built on violence. No matter how rich the merchants were, they were just lambs waiting to be slaughtered in front of the nobles. Marquis Vincent used a bloody corpse to make the half-elf merchants realize the cruel reality. Some of them had ashen faces, but they didn't dare to say anything. Some were terrified and avoided eye contact. Some were dejected and had completely accepted their fate. Javier was sweating profusely, and his heart was filled with regret. He thought that he had invited a strong ally, but he didn't expect that this wasn't a strong ally, but a wolf. If that was the case, he felt that he should have just followed Count Angeli. Just as everyone was sitting on pins and needles, a half-elf merchant hesitantly raised his hand and stuttered, "Lord Marquis. That. I drank too much water. I need to go to the toilet." Marquis Vincent glanced at that person and coldly said, "Hold it in." That person's face turned pale, and he laughed dryly as he nodded. He seemed to be talking to himself. All right, I can still hold it in. The conference room was filled with an oppressive atmosphere, and it was almost suffocating. Finally, Marquis Vincent spoke again. Let's continue the topic. I know that you are worried about your food, but if you want to change Silvery Moon City, how can you not pay a price? Do you really think that you don't have to do anything and can just sit back and enjoy the fruits of others' labor? Marquis Vincent's gaze swept around, and he found that no one dared to look him in the eye. No one dared to refute him, so his tone became gentler. Of course, after this matter is completed, you will also get a share of the profits. Perhaps it will be able to make up for your losses. Hearing this, everyone's faces lit up with joy, and they all began to praise the kindness and generosity of the House of Saint Prospero. Marquis Vincent sneered inwardly as he watched these mercenary merchants change their faces, but he didn't show it on his face. At this point, the two sides finally reached an agreement. According to Marquis Vincent's request, the half-elf merchants would ignite their own granaries at the designated time to cause chaos. After overthrowing the rule of Queen Aisha and driving away the army of the north, they would receive part of the compensation from the east. However, Marquis Vincent didn't mention how much and how he would compensate them. If it was in the past, the half-elf merchants would definitely scoff at such empty promises. But now, facing the powerful Marquis Vincent and that bloody corpse, they didn't dare to ask any questions. At this time, they could only comfort themselves. The House of Saint Prospero's reputation should still be trustworthy. Seeing that he had achieved his goal, Marquis Vincent ignored the merchant's passionate pleas for him to stay and walked out. Outside the door, the low-key carriage was still parked in the same place, but there were more guards around it. Marquis Vincent impatiently dismissed Javier and the rest, and walked to the front of the carriage alone. He asked the knight beside him, "Have you invited Duke Modwin?" The knight's face stiffened, and he shook his head. "Sir, Duke Modwin isn't willing to come." Marquis Vincent frowned and was about to scold him, but he heard the knight say, "However, we have invited Duke Modwin's son, Charlie Modwin." Marquis Vincent's face softened, and he asked, "How many sons does Duke Modwin have?" "Just this one." "Good." Marquis Vincent nodded and stepped into the carriage. The interior of the carriage was spacious, and the decorations were more luxurious than the exterior. "Respected Marquis Vincent, welcome to Silvery Moon City." Looking at the young boy in front of him, Marquis Vincent smiled and said, "Charlie, how old are you?" "I'm 12 years old this year, respected Marquis." Marquis Vincent nodded and gestured for Charlie to sit down. He then sat down himself and lamented, "Your father doesn't dare to come and see me. Is he afraid that I'll blame him for lying to me last time?" "Father lied to you?" Charlie asked blankly. Marquis Vincent suddenly realized that this little guy in front of him didn't know anything at all, and the reason he appeared in his carriage was probably the result of the House of Medea being dissatisfied with Queen Aisha's rule. Therefore, Marquis Vincent lost the desire to chat with this little kid, and he smiled, "That's some old story, so I won't go into it." "Charlie, do you know why you came to see me?" "Yes." "Oh. Why?" "To overthrow Queen Aisha's rule," Charlie said in a young voice, and his expression was very serious. Marquis Vincent looked at the little boy in front of him with interest, and continued to ask, "Then tell me, how do you plan to overthrow Queen Aisha's rule?" "Queen Aisha is about to give birth, and I'll take this opportunity to lead the Silvermoon Guard into the palace and force her to return the throne to the House of Medea." "So you're saying that you have the confidence to make the Silvermoon Guard listen to your orders?" "Yes." "But the commander of the Silvermoon Guard is clearly your father, right? Will he agree to your actions?" "Father is a coward," Charlie said disdainfully, "but I've already met the uncles of the Silvermoon Guard, and they all support me." "That's impressive," Marquis Vincent praised, but he was sneering in his heart. The half-elf nobles really have guts to actually let a little kid take the lead. But of course, Marquis Vincent would not remind Charlie that his uncles were only afraid of taking responsibility, and pushed him to take the lead. Marquis Vincent's praise made Charlie raise his head proudly, as if he could already see the annoying Queen Aisha begging for forgiveness in front of him. Charlie, why do you want to overthrow Queen Aisha's rule? Because the half-elf throne originally belonged to the House of Media, and grandfather also told me that Aisha is a bad woman. Marquis Vincent was stunned for a moment before he realized that the grandfather Charlie was referring to was the old half-elf king, who was also Queen Aisha's husband. Thinking of this, a satisfied smile appeared on his face, and he nodded, good. As expected of a young hero from the House of Media. Don't worry, the East doesn't like Queen Aisha, and when the time is right, I'll stand up and support the House of Media. Thank you for your support. The friendship between the House of Saint Prospero and the House of Media will last forever. Seeing that his empty words had made Charlie so grateful, Marquis Vincent couldn't help but laugh coldly in his heart, and at the same time, lament, the House of Media was really getting worse with each generation. The old king was a strong opponent that even the Duke of the East had to take seriously. As for Prince William, who was now Duke Modwin, even though he wasn't very smart, he could at least see the situation clearly. As for Charlie, of course, Marquis Vincent definitely didn't care about the future of the House of Media, and he didn't have any psychological burden to send a teenager to the battlefield. Marquis Vincent only sent Charlie off after a few more words of encouragement. Sitting alone in the carriage, Marquis Vincent fell into deep thought. He was very clear that if he wanted to rely on the half-elf merchants and the Silvermoon Guard led by a brat to overturn Silvermoon City, it would still be a fool's dream. Fortunately, his plan didn't stop there. Thinking of this, Marquis Vincent reached out and knocked on the side of the carriage, instructing, to the Temple of Destiny. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.